Okay, and tonight, everyone, we have 6 stories. All of them came out with the same question. What if the thing in the woods does not just know your name? What if it knows your wife, your daughter, the brother you buried, the father you have not spoken to in 11 years, the 6-year-old who is supposed to be home asleep with his mother, the mother you put in the ground 9 years ago, 6 men, 6 voices that should not have been answered, should not have been speaking, 6 nights they spoke anyway. But real quick before we start, I just want to remind everybody, if you would like to support directly what I am doing and here to help me keep writing this stuff full time, the merch store is now officially live, just darkhorrornarrations.com. So far I have some t-shirts, some hoodies, playing cards, phone cases, things like that. I do plan to have more stuff coming, including some unique memorabilia, if you will. Still trying to work out the kinks for that. But with all that said, please dim your lights, pull the covers up, and let's get into tonight's horror. Thank you guys for watching. See you at the end.
The sun in the pines. I was running uphill through second growth ponderosa with the bladder bag bouncing against my back and the Pulaski in my right hand and the radio in my left, while Eli's voice was calling Dad from in front of me. And Eli's voice was calling Dad from behind me, and the smoke that should have been to the west was coming down the slope from the east. The wind had been steady out of the west for 2 hours. The wind had not changed. The smoke had changed. My son was at home with his mother in Bend, 90 miles south. Dispatch had called the fire in at 1:15 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in August. Lightning strike, no rain behind it, single tree in the upper Ochocos, northeast of Prineville. Air attack had flown over and called it 10 by 10, smoldering in a snag, low priority, send a single resource. I had been the closest resource. I had been sitting in my truck at the Big Summit guard station, eating a sandwich and listening to the radio when the call came through. I had keyed the mic and said I had it. I had cleared with dispatch and started up the rough road that runs north out of the Big Summit toward the Lookout Mountain country, with the Pulaski in the bladder bag and a 5-gallon of water in the back of the truck. I am 35. I have been on the line for 9 summers. I started in 2018 on a hand crew out of John Day and worked my way up through engine crews and hell attack and finally settled into the prevention and initial attack work I do out of the Lookout Mountain District. I like the solo work. Not everybody does. There are people who need a crew around them. I have always done better when it was me and a Pulaski and a small problem in the trees somewhere that I could put a line around. A 10 by 10 lightning hole in a snag is a clean job. You hike in, you cut the snag down, you scrape a line, you put the bag on it, you mop up the duff, you wait an hour, you hike out. 3 hours start to finish on a good day. My ex-wife is named Kara. We were married for 8 years. Eli was born in 2020 in the spring of the bad fire year, and I missed his birth because I was on the Beachy Creek complex out west of Salem. Kara never said anything about it, but I think she did the math on what kind of marriage we were going to have, and she did not like the answer, and she filed 2 summers later. The divorce was not bad. We had not had time to make each other into the kind of enemies people make in long marriages. Eli was 3 when the papers got signed. He turned 6 in May. He lives with Kara in a small house off Brookswood in Bend, and I have him every other weekend. And the weekends in the summer I am usually on a fire, and Kara is patient about it. And Eli is the kind of kid who lights up when I walk in the door but does not break when I have to leave. He is small for his age. He is going into kindergarten in the fall. He has Kara's blonde hair and my mother's gray eyes, and a small bald spot above his left ear that he was born with, that the doctor said would fill in by puberty. He sleeps with a stuffed elephant named Pickle. He is afraid of the noise the wind makes in the chimney at Kara's house. He calls me Dad. He used to call me Daddy until he turned 5, and then he switched to Dad without ever discussing it with anybody, and I had not realized how much I was going to miss the Daddy until it was gone. I had not seen him in 2 weeks. I had been running back to back to back, 10-day on, 2 off on the Bridge Creek fire in the Painted Hills, the Mill Creek holdover outside Prineville, and this stretch on initial attack out of Big Summit, my next shift off, was 4 days away. I had told him on the phone the night before that we would go to the John Day River and look for trout. He had been excited about it. He had told me he had been practicing his cast in the backyard with the pole I had given him for his birthday. It is the kind of thing that scrapes against the back of your mind on the bad days. You take a job that puts you in the woods alone. You do it well. You do it because it is the kind of work that makes you feel like you are made out of something. And then a Tuesday afternoon comes up where you are eating a sandwich at the Big Summit guard station, and you are thinking about your son, and you have not held him in 2 weeks, and the radio crackles, and you take it, because that is what you do. You do not turn down a fire. You do not say to dispatch, "Hold on, I am thinking about my son." You take the fire. My father had been a logger out of Sweet Home until I was about 12. He was killed by a widowmaker in a unit east of Detroit Lake the summer I started 7th grade. He had been 41. My mother had moved us back to her people in Bend. She had not remarried. She had died of pancreatic cancer when I was 23, in a hospital bed in Bend Memorial, 3 months from diagnosis to gone. There was a window between when my father died and when my mother got sick that was about 10 years long, and in those 10 years, I did not let myself love anybody in a way that would hurt me when they left. That was the shape of me. When Kara left, I did not fight it. When Eli was born, I tried to fight it. I am still fighting it. The fight has not gone the way I wanted. The road up to the Lookout Mountain country goes from gravel to 2-track to single-track in about 40 minutes. I parked the truck at a wide spot near the saddle below the fire, and I shouldered the bladder bag, and I took the Pulaski and the radio and the 5-gallon of water, and I started up the slope on foot. The fire had been called as about half a mile in. I had ribbon in my pocket to flag the route on the way in so I could find my way out if the smoke got bad. The first sign of trouble was at the saddle. The saddle was a low spot between 2 rocky knobs, about a quarter mile in from the road. I came up out of the trees onto the saddle, and I stopped to drink water and to listen for the fire, and that was when I saw the tracks. They were in a patch of soft dirt at the edge of an old game trail, crossing the saddle. There were 2 sets of tracks. One was the print of a bear, a black bear, maybe a 200-pound sow, by the size and the way the claws dug in. The other was the print of a child's tennis shoe, a small one, maybe size 11 or 12. The tread pattern was the kind of cheap canvas sneaker pattern they sell at the Walmart in Bend. The 2 sets of tracks were going the same direction. They were going up the slope toward the fire. They were the same depth and the same age. They were side by side. The space between the child's tracks and the bear's tracks was about 18 inches, like a small kid walking next to a bear, like they were going somewhere together. There was no reason on God's green earth for a 6-year-old in canvas sneakers to be 6 miles in on a Forest Service 2-track in the Ochocos in August. There was no reason for him to be there at the same time as a bear. There was no reason for him to be there at all. The closest trailhead was the one I had driven up. The closest occupied campground was 12 miles back down the road. There were no kids' tracks anywhere else on the road. Just here, at the saddle, going up the same direction as a bear. I keyed the radio. I called dispatch. I told them I had child tracks at the saddle and asked if there were any reported lost persons in the district. Dispatch came back negative. They said they would call the sheriff. I said, let me get up on the fire first. I said I would call them back. I started up the slope. The wind was steady out of the west, light, maybe 5 miles an hour. I could smell the fire when I came over the lip of the saddle. It was up in a draw to the east. I could see the column. It was small, black smoke, mostly steam at this point, the way a punky snag smokes when it is half wet. A 10 by 10 was generous. It was probably a 6 by 6. Easy work. The trail went through a stand of old ponderosa, and I noticed when I came in under the trees that I could not hear any birds. There had been jays at the saddle. There had been jays since I parked the truck. There were no birds in this stretch of trail. The wind was up in the tops of the trees, and I could hear it, but there was no other sound. I noticed this the way you notice when somebody has stopped talking. I kept walking. I told myself the birds had moved off because of the fire smoke. The fire smoke was hardly any smoke at all yet. The birds had not moved off because of the smoke. I told myself it anyway. About halfway up the slope, I came on a place where the trail crossed a small open patch of duff between two ponderosas. There was a name carved into the bark of the ponderosa on the right-hand side of the trail. The name was at chest height. It was carved in deep block letters. The letters spelled Eli. The cuts were old. The wood inside the cuts was gray. The carving had been there for years. There was no reason for my son's name to be carved into a ponderosa 6 miles in on a Forest Service 2-track in the Upper Ochocos. I walked past it. I did not stop. I did not stop, and I did not photograph it, and I did not key the radio, and I did not go back to the truck. I walked past it, and I kept walking up the slope toward the snag. That was the decision. I made it. I was about 100 yards from the snag when I caught a smell that did not belong. It was strawberry shampoo. Eli used a particular kind of strawberry kids shampoo from a pink bottle with a cartoon strawberry on it. Kara had been using it since he was 2. He smelled like strawberry shampoo all summer long. I had not smelled that shampoo in 2 weeks. The smell was strong. It was so strong it was on top of the fire smell. I stopped in the middle of the trail and I turned in a slow circle. There was nothing around me but ponderosa and some bitterbrush and a couple of small junipers. I was alone on the slope. I could see the snag up the draw, and I could see the road behind me through the trees. There was nobody on the slope but me. The smell stayed. It moved with me a little when I started walking again, like it was on something I was carrying. I checked the Pulaski. I checked the bladder bag. I checked the front of my Nomex. There was nothing on me that smelled like Eli's shampoo. The smell was just there. I got to the snag. The snag was a 40-foot ponderosa that had been hit by lightning probably the day before. It had burned down to a tall stump about 10 feet high. The stump was glowing in 3 or 4 places where the punky wood was still hot. There was a small bed of fire in the duff at the base of the stump, maybe 4 feet across, smoldering in the litter and the needle cast. Easy job. Cut the snag down. Scrape a line. Wet the duff. Wait it out. I set the bladder bag down. I picked up the Pulaski. I made a circle around the snag to look for spot fires and to check the duff and to plan the cut. I came around to the back side of the snag and I stopped. There was a stuffed elephant in the duff. It was about 4 feet from the base of the snag. It was lying on its side in the cast of pine needles. It was gray and it had a small bow tie sewn around its neck, and it had a name written on the bow tie in marker. The name was Pickle. It was Eli's elephant. The elephant had been with him since before he was born. Kara had bought it for him at a Walgreens in Bend the week before he was born. She had been having heartburn at 6 months pregnant, and we had gone to the Walgreens at 2 a.m. to get a bottle of Tums, and the elephant had been on a clearance end cap, and Kara had said, "Let's get it for the baby." The elephant had been at his bed in the hospital. The elephant had been in his crib. The elephant had been in his bed every night for 6 years. The bow tie had the name in marker because Kara had written it on with a Sharpie when he was 4 and had started taking the elephant to daycare. Her handwriting, the name was in her handwriting. I picked it up. The elephant smelled like Eli. It smelled like strawberry shampoo. It was warm. I keyed the radio. I called dispatch. The radio crackled. There was no answer. I called again. Dispatch did not come back. I tried channel 2. I tried channel 3. There was nothing on the radio but static. I stood at the snag with the elephant in one hand and the Pulaski in the other, and the radio in my coat pocket squawking static, and I tried to think. I was not thinking well. There was a small fire smoldering 10 feet away from me, and a stuffed elephant in my hand that was 400 miles from where it was supposed to be, and a smell on the wind that was my son's, and the wind had been steady, but I noticed now that the smoke off the snag had started to lean, and it was leaning east against the wind. which the smoke off a snag does not do. A voice said, "Dad." It was Eli's voice. It was from up the slope about 20 yards above me in the trees. The voice said, "Dad, I'm hot." The voice said, "Dad, I want to go home." I put the elephant down. I set it on a flat rock by the snag. I picked up the Pulaski. I started up the slope toward the voice. "Dad," the voice said. I had taken maybe 10 steps when another voice said, "Dad," behind me. I stopped. I turned. The second voice was also Eli's. It was at the base of the slope, near where I had come up from the saddle. The same age, the same small, thin sound. The second voice said, "Dad, come back." The second voice said, "Dad, I'm scared." Then a third voice said, "Dad," and it was off to my left, in a small grove of lodgepole. 3 of them, 3 voices, all his, calling me from 3 directions. I stood on the slope with the Pulaski in my hand, and the wind moving against me from the wrong direction, and I felt the inside of my mouth go cold, and I dropped the Pulaski. "Dad," the first voice said, from up the slope. "Dad," the second voice said, from down the slope. "Dad," the third voice said, from the lodge poles. I picked the Pulaski back up. I started down, not toward any of the voices, just down the slope, off the trail, through the bitter brush, through the small junipers, with the bladder bag bouncing on my back and the Pulaski in my right hand and the radio still static in my pocket. I went down the slope and I came out at the saddle and I went down across the saddle and I started back along the trail toward the truck. That was when I started running. The voices kept calling Dad. They moved with me. They moved alongside me. They were in the trees on my left and they were in the trees on my right and they were behind me. Sometimes one of them would say, "Dad, please." Sometimes one of them would say, "Dad, I'm scared." Sometimes one of them would say, "I miss you." Sometimes one of them would say things Eli said, specific things. Things he had said to me on the phone the night before. "Dad, let's get the trout in the part of the river where the rocks are." "Dad, I cast it into the bush." "Dad, you said we could put a worm on this time." I ran. I had the Pulaski in one hand and I was holding the bladder bag straps on my shoulders with the other to keep it from bouncing too hard. I ran in the kind of way you run when you are running from something you cannot let yourself look at. I went past the saddle and down the slope on the other side and along the 2-track in a kind of stumbling lope with my Nomex hot against my chest and my breath coming hard, and the voices kept calling Dad from the trees on both sides of the road. I came around the last bend and the truck was there, where I had left it, at the wide spot. The bed was open the way I had left it. The 5-gallon of water was still in the bed. The driver's door was closed. I went to the driver's door. The voices were still calling Dad. Closer now. They were maybe 20 yards back in the trees. 3 of them, all at once. I got the door open, and I threw the Pulaski into the passenger footwell, and I shrugged the bladder bag off and threw it into, and I got in the truck and I closed the door, and I locked the doors with the button on the panel. I had not been able to take a full breath since the snag. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel, and I made myself breathe. In, out, in, out. The voices stopped. Then a small voice on the other side of the driver's window said, "Dad." I did not look. I had made up my mind on that. I did not look. I sat with my hands on the wheel, and I did not turn my head to the driver's window. The voice said, "Dad." The voice said, "Dad, open the door. I'm cold." The voice said, "Dad, it's me." I started the truck. I put it in reverse. I backed out of the wide spot. I did not look at the window. I drove down the 2-track with my hands at 10 and 2 and the windows up and the AC on full and the radio still static on the dash. I drove for 6 miles before I tried the radio again. By then it had cleared. Dispatch came back when I keyed the mic. I told them I had not been able to put the snag down. I told them I had had a medical and was coming off the fire. Dispatch came back and asked if I needed an aid car. I said no. I said I just needed to come off. I drove all the way down to Big Summit. I parked at the guard station. I sat in the truck for 20 minutes with the engine running. I had not said anything to dispatch about the elephant or the tracks or the voices. I called Kara. She answered on the third ring. Eli was watching TV in the living room. She put him on the phone. He talked to me about a beetle he had found in the backyard. He asked me when we were going to the river. He sounded like himself. I told him I would be there in 2 days. I told him I loved him. I told him to be a good boy for his mom. He said, "Okay, Dad." He said, "Love you." He hung up. I drove back into Prineville. I went to the station. I wrote up the fire as a holdover and a redispatch needed. I did not write up the tracks. I did not write up the voices. I told my captain I had heat exhaustion. He looked at me a long time. He told me to take the 4 days off and to come back next week. He said something I do not want to write down here about how he had seen this look on guys before and how the look did not get better the longer you sat with it and how I should talk to somebody. I told him I would. I drove down to Bend that night. I did not call ahead. I parked at the curb in front of the house on Brookswood. Kara came to the door in her pajamas. It was 11. Eli was asleep. She let me in. She made coffee. We sat at her kitchen table and she did not ask me what was wrong, which was a thing she had always been good at, the not asking, the way that gave you room to say it on your own. I asked her if I could go into Eli's room. She said, of course. I went down the hall to Eli's room. He was asleep on his side, with Pickle the elephant under his arm. I stood in the doorway, and I looked at him for a long time. The elephant was the elephant. The bow tie was the bow tie. The name was in Kara's handwriting on the bow tie. Pickle. I went back to the kitchen. I told Kara I had had a bad day. I told her I had needed to see him. She nodded. She did not push. She asked me if I wanted to sleep on the couch. I said yes. She made up the couch and she went to bed, and I lay on the couch with my boots off and my Nomex jacket draped over the back of a chair, and I did not sleep. Around 4, I got up. I went to the kitchen for water. The kitchen light was off. The hall light was on. The hall light made a yellow rectangle on the kitchen tile. There was a small figure standing in the rectangle. It was about the height of Eli. It had its back to me. It was facing the kitchen window. I could see the shape of a small head and a small body and a small bow tie sewn at the back of a small gray elephant in its hand. The figure was standing very still in the light from the hall. I said his name. I said Eli. The figure did not turn around. It said, "Dad." It said, "Dad, I'm not tired." It said, "Dad, I want to go to the river." I did not move. I stood in the dark of the kitchen, and I looked at the small figure standing in the rectangle of yellow light. I could see the back of his head, the bald spot above the left ear, the fine blonde hair, the cowlick. I said his name again. He did not turn around. He said, "Dad, why did you go in my room?" He said, "Dad, I saw you." He said, "Dad, it's me." The hall light went out. I do not know what knocked it out. The hall light at Kara's house is on a regular wall switch, and there was nobody in the hall to flip it, and the switch did not have a smart bulb, and I do not know what knocked it out. The light went out, and the kitchen was full dark for a second, the kind of full dark you get in a house with no streetlights outside, and then a small light came on. It was the night light in the hall. It is a little plastic one, shaped like a moon. It throws a circle of pale blue, and the circle of pale blue. I could see the hall. I could see the door to Eli's room at the end of the hall. The door was closed. There was nobody in the hall. I went down the hall slow. I opened the door to Eli's room. He was in his bed, asleep, on his side, Pickle the elephant under his arm. His breath was slow and even. The room smelled like strawberry shampoo. He was asleep. I closed the door. I went back to the couch. I lay down. I did not sleep. I have not been back on the fire line. It has been 3 weeks. I called my captain, and I told him I was taking the rest of the season off. He said okay. He said he had been expecting the call. He did not ask. Eli is 6. He is going to start kindergarten in 2 weeks. His backpack is hanging on a hook by Kara's front door, It has a green dinosaur on it. He picked it out at the Target in Bend the week before the fire. He does not know anything about any of it. He still calls me Dad. He still smells like strawberry shampoo. I have been staying in Bend at a small cabin I rented off Brookswood, 2 blocks from Kara's house. Kara and I have not talked about it. She lets me come over for dinner 3 nights a week. Eli sits on my lap and shows me his Legos. He calls me Dad. I look at him, and I look at him. Last week he asked me why I was looking at him so much. He asked it the way a kid asks the kind of question that has been sitting in his chest for a while. He was on my lap and he had the Legos out on the coffee table, and he had built me a small house, and he asked me why I was looking at him so much, Dad. I said I had missed him. He nodded. He said it was okay, Dad. He said it was okay to look. He went back to the Legos. Kara watched me from the kitchen. She did not say anything. After dinner, she walked me out to my truck, and she stood at the open window, and she said, Ben, she said, are you all right? I said, I was getting there. She said, you know you can talk to me. I said, I know. She said, do you want to talk to me? I said, not yet. She put her hand on the door frame. She tapped it twice with her knuckle. She said, okay. She said, okay, Ben. She said, come for dinner Thursday. She has been kinder to me in the last 3 weeks than she was in any year of our marriage. I do not know what to do with that. I keep thinking about her in the kitchen with the dish rag over her shoulder and the way she looked at me when I left. And I keep thinking about Eli on my lap with the small house of Legos in his hand. And I keep thinking about the way the voice in the trees said, Dad, it's me, and I do not know what to do with any of it. There are nights when I am at the cabin in bed and I will hear a small voice from outside the window. It says, Dad. It says, Dad, I am out here. It says, Dad, let me in. I keep the curtains closed. I keep the bedroom door closed. I keep the lamp on. I do not get out of bed. I lie in the bed with the lamp on, and I listen to my son call me from outside the window of a cabin in Bend, Oregon, and I do not get out of bed because my son is 2 blocks away, asleep in his own bed, with an elephant named Pickle under his arm. He is 2 blocks away. He is 2 blocks away. The voice keeps calling. I do not get out of bed. The father in the barn. The deadbolt on the barn door was thrown, and I was leaning against the door with my whole weight on it, and on the other side of the door I could hear the rake handle scraping across the dirt floor in a slow circle. My father's voice was coming through the wood at chest height, low, friendly, the way he had spoken when he was about to ask me for something. Sammy boy, he said, come on in here and help me with the tractor. The PTO is hung up again. He had been dead for 8 months. I had gotten up that morning at the Buffalo Best Western and driven the rental car out to the ranch through a sky that was going to give snow by afternoon. The radio in the rental had been pulling a station out of Sheridan that played mostly country I had not heard in 20 years, and I had let it play because I had been driving out to my father's place to spend a week clearing it out, and country I had not heard in 20 years was the kind of music my father had played in his truck when I was a kid, and I had been working up to the visit for 8 months, and the music was helping. The ranch sits on 640 acres at the foot of the eastern Bighorns, off a county road that has not been graveled since the 80s. It is a 1-story ranch house with cedar siding and a tin roof, a fenced kitchen garden that has not been planted in 15 years, a windbreak of cottonwoods on the north side that my father had set himself in 1978, and a barn that is older than the house. My father had built the house in the early 70s on a piece of land that had been my grandfather's. The barn had come with the land. The barn was from before, from 1890-something, my father had said. The hand-hewn beams inside it had marks on them from the broad axe. There was a rusted square nail driven into one of the posts that I had pulled on as a kid and not been able to budge. My father had died in that barn in February. He had been 71. He had gone out one morning to feed the 2 horses he still kept, and he had taken a heart attack between the feed room and the stalls, and he had gone down into the straw, and he had not gotten up. The horses had stood in their stalls and watched him die. A neighbor had found him 3 days later, when the mail had started to pile up. The coroner had said it had been quick. I had not asked many questions about quick. I had asked how. 3 days. The coroner had not answered. My father and I had not spoken in 11 years. I had not spoken to him since 2015. He had said something to my wife that he should not have said, and I had told him that he was not going to see me or his grandchildren until he wrote her an apology, and he had not written an apology, and that had been that. He had died without one between us, and I had spent a long time trying to figure out what I felt about that, and most of what I felt was that it had been his choice, and he had made it, and a man does not get to be 11 years dead to his son and then come back through being actually dead and have the book squared. That was the line I had been taking. It was a hard line to take when the man was alive. It got harder to take when the man was in the ground. My sister Beth was in San Diego and would not come. She had not come for the funeral, and she was not going to come for the clean out, and I had stopped being angry about that years ago. Beth had had her own ride with him. He had not been the same kind of bad to her that he had been to me. He had been a different kind of bad to her, and Beth had decided when she was 18 that she was not going to spend any more time on him, and Beth was disciplined in a way I have never been. She had cashed the inheritance check the lawyer had sent her, and she had told me to do whatever I wanted with the rest. I had not cashed mine yet. I had been turning the check over in my pocket for 8 months. I drove up the lane around 9. The cottonwoods had lost their leaves. The kitchen garden was buried in tumbleweed. The house looked the way a house looks when nobody has been in it for a while. The barn looked the way a barn looks when nobody has been in it for a while too, but a barn looks that way most of the time anyway. I let myself into the house with the key the lawyer had mailed me. The smell hit me at the door. Camel cigarettes and pine cleaner. He had smoked Camel since he was 14 years old, and he had cleaned the kitchen floor with the same yellow bottle of Pine Sol my whole childhood. The smell of those two things had been the smell of the house my entire life. The smell was still there. It was so strong it was like I had walked into a smaller room than I was actually in. I stood in the doorway with the key in my hand. The kitchen looked the way it had looked when I had been 15. The table was where it had been. The chairs were where they had been. There was a coffee cup on the table next to the chair my father had always sat in. There was coffee dried in the bottom of the cup. There was a saucer next to the cup with the butt end of a camel in it. The cigarette had been smoked down to the filter. The ash was in the saucer. My father had died on a Tuesday morning in February. The neighbor had found him on a Friday. The neighbor had called the sheriff, and the sheriff had called the coroner, and the coroner had taken the body out of the barn, and the lawyer had locked the house. Nobody had been in the kitchen since the Tuesday. The coffee on the table was 8 months old. The cigarette in the saucer was 8 months old. I sat down at the table. I do not know how long I sat there. The light was the gray light of a snow afternoon, and it had moved across the linoleum and gotten thinner before I stood back up. I started in the kitchen. I made boxes and put labels on them. Keep, donate, trash. I emptied cabinets. I emptied drawers. There were things in the kitchen drawers I had not thought about in 30 years. The little wooden ruler with my mother's name written on it in her hand. The good steak knives in the woodblock that he had never let any of us use. A pack of birthday candles that had been opened and used once. My mother had died when I was 10. She had had a brain aneurysm at the kitchen sink, and she had been gone before the ambulance got there. The candles had been from my birthday the year before she died. They were the half-melted candles from my 9th birthday cake. I put the candles in the keep box. I put a lot of things in the keep box that first morning that I did not need to be keeping. I worked through lunch. Around 2, I went out to the porch to call my wife and tell her I was alive. The cell service at the ranch is bad. You have to stand at a particular corner of the porch, under the porch light fixture, to pull a bar. I stood there with the phone to my ear, and I looked out across the yard at the barn while my wife told me about her morning at the school. The wind was up out of the west. The barn doors were closed. The barn doors had been closed since the coroner had closed them in February. The porch light came on while I was talking to her. It was 2 in the afternoon. There was no timer on the porch light. There had never been a timer on the porch light. My father had hated timers. He had said timers were for people who could not be bothered to flip a switch. The porch light had been off when I had walked out, and it had come on while I was on the phone, and there was nobody in the house behind me, because I had been the only person to come into the house that morning, and I had locked the door behind me when I had come out to make the call. I told my wife I had to go. I told her I loved her. I hung up. I went back inside. The house was empty. I checked every room. The basement was empty. The closets were empty. There was nobody in the house. I went and looked at the light switch by the front door. The light switch was up. The porch light was on. I flipped the switch. The porch light went off. I flipped it again. The porch light came on. I worked through the afternoon. I packed up the closet in the hall. There was a wool coat in the closet that had been his coat. I took it off the hanger to fold it into a box, and a folded piece of paper fell out of the inside pocket. The paper was a Polaroid. The Polaroid was of me and Beth, and our mother in front of the barn. We were small. I was maybe 6. Beth was maybe 4. Our mother had her arms around both of us. We were squinting in the sun. On the back of the Polaroid, in my father's hand, was written my name in pencil. Just my name, nothing else. I sat on the floor of the hall with the Polaroid and the coat across my lap, and I looked at the photograph for a while. Then I put the Polaroid in my shirt pocket. I put the coat in the keep box. A little later, I was in the basement going through a storage shelf. There were boxes of receipts and a box of old check registers and a box of empty mason jars. On the top shelf, there was a coffee can. It was a Folgers can. The plastic lid was on it. The can had weight to it. I took the lid off. The can was full of pennies. I pulled it down to set it on the workbench, and as I turned with it in my hand, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye in the small basement window that faced the yard. There had been a face in the window. I want to be careful here. I did not see the face when I looked at it. By the time I had set the coffee can down and turned to the window was empty. The window looked out across the yard toward the barn. The wind was blowing the dry grass at the foot of the foundation. There was nothing at the window. But there had been a face. I had caught it in the corner of my eye. It had been a face I knew. It had been my father's face. I went back upstairs. I worked through the afternoon. I did not go out to the barn. The plan had been to start in the barn on day 2. The house was the smaller job. The barn was going to be the long job. I worked until 4, and the light started to go, and I put my jacket on, and I drove back into Buffalo, and I had dinner at the Bozeman Trail Steakhouse on Main Street, and I drank 2 whiskeys, and I went back to the Best Western, and I lay on the bed, and I watched the news, and I did not sleep well. Tuesday morning, I drove back out to the ranch, and the cottonwoods on the north side were moving the way trees move in wind, and there was no wind. I stood in the lane with the rental car running behind me, and I watched the cottonwoods sway. The grass at my feet was still. The fence wire was still. The American flag on the pole by the gate was still. The cottonwoods were moving like there was a wind in them that did not exist anywhere else. I let myself into the house. I worked through the morning. I packed up the bedroom that had been my mother's side of the dresser. The dresser had not been opened in 35 years. There were her things in it. Stockings, a little leather case with rings in it, a scarf with a print of dogwood flowers on it that I had not thought about in 3 decades. There was a smell that came up out of the dresser drawer when I opened it that I knew the way you know somebody by their voice. It was her. It was her perfume. It was the perfume my mother had worn when I was a kid. It had been in the drawer for 35 years, and it was still there. I sat on the edge of the bed with the scarf in my hand, and I did something I had not done in a long time. When I had pulled myself back together, I stood up. There was a sound coming from down the hall. It was a small, steady rhythm. It took me a second to place it. It was the kitchen faucet. It was dripping. I had not used the kitchen faucet that morning. I had not turned it on. I had not turned it on yesterday either. The water at the ranch was on a well. and the well had a pressure tank in the basement that needed to be checked, and the lawyer had told me that the water had been shut off after my father had died. I went down the hall to the kitchen. The faucet was dripping. The handle was not turned. The drip was slow and even. There was a small puddle in the bottom of the sink. I touched the puddle. The water was warm. I went down to the basement. The valve on the water line was closed. The valve had been closed since February. The valve was still closed. I went back upstairs. The faucet was still dripping. I watched it for a while. The drip stopped. I went back to work in the bedroom. That afternoon I worked in the front room. I cleaned out the bookshelf. There were paperback Louis L'Amour westerns, and a Bible from his mother, and a stack of National Geographic magazines from the 70s. Behind the National Geographics, there was a metal box about the size of a cigar box. It had a hasp on it. I pulled it down. It was heavier than I expected. I set it on the coffee table. I opened the hasp. The box was full of letters. The letters were addressed to me. There were maybe 40 of them. Some of them were in envelopes with my address in Spokane on them, addressed in my father's hand. Some of them were just folded pieces of paper. None of them had been sent. The dates on the envelopes ran from 2015 through last year. The most recent one was dated January. He had written one a month for 11 years, and he had not sent any of them. He had put them in the box and put the box behind the National Geographics, and he had died. I did not read them. I closed the hasp. I sat with the box in my lap on the couch for a long time. The light went down. I was thinking about driving back to the motel when I heard the barn door slide open. The barn door is a big sliding door, the kind that runs on a rail, and when it slides, it makes a long, low sound that I had known my whole childhood. It is the sound of my father going out to work. It is the sound I had heard every morning from the time I was 4 years old until the time I was 18 and left the house. The door slid open and the sound came through the front window of the house, and I sat on the couch with the box of letters in my lap and I listened. The door slid shut. Then the door slid open again. Then it slid shut. I sat on the couch with the box in my lap, and I listened to the barn door open and close, slow, the way a man does it when he is moving something heavy in and out of a building. I do not know how many times it did it. I counted 10 and stopped counting. The light through the front window went from gray to indigo to black. When the barn door stopped sliding, the silence was so loud, I stood up. I set the box on the couch. I went to the kitchen. I picked up the flashlight off the windowsill. I went out the back door. A cold hit me on the face. The wind was up. The snow had started to come down sideways out of the west. I crossed the yard with flashlight on the path in front of me, and I crossed to the barn, and I stood at the sliding door, and the door was closed. I put my ear against the door. It was 5:30 on a Tuesday evening in October in the snow at my father's ranch in Wyoming, with the wind in the cottonwoods and the snow coming down sideways, and the box of letters on the couch inside. I heard him whistling. He was whistling Wabash Cannonball. He had whistled it my whole childhood while he worked. He had whistled it while he changed the oil in the truck, and while he stacked hay, and while he stretched fence, and while he saddled the horses. He had a particular way of holding the third note longer than the others. The whistle through the barn wall held the third note longer. I heard him stop whistling. I heard him say something. I could not catch the words. I heard him say Sammy Boy. He was the only person who had ever called me Sammy Boy. He had stopped calling me that when I had turned 12. He had not called me that in 33 years. I stepped back from the door. The deadbolt was thrown from the outside. I had thrown it that morning before I had gone into the house. The deadbolt was a heavy steel bar that slid into a socket in the door frame, and there was a padlock through the hasp. The padlock was a brass master padlock, and the key was in my pocket. The padlock was locked. The deadbolt was thrown. The door was secure. The whistling came back. Wabash Cannonball. Third note long. I leaned my whole weight against the door. I do not know why. Some part of me must have thought the door was about to come open. Some part of me must have decided that I was going to hold the door shut. I stood there in the wind with the snow on my back and my hands flat on the wood of the door, and I leaned and I felt the wood vibrate against my palms while the whistling went on inside. The whistling stopped. The voice came through the wood at chest height. It was low. It was friendly. It was the voice he had used when he was about to ask me for something. "Sammy boy," the voice said, "come on in here and help me with the tractor. The PTO is hung up again." I did not say anything. The voice said son. It said it the way he had said it when he had been trying. There had been a couple of years in my late teens when he had been trying. The voice had that in it. I had my whole weight on the door. My ear was against the wood. I could hear him on the other side. I could hear the small sound of his boots on the dirt floor. The boots had a particular hitch. He had walked with a small hitch since he had broken his ankle in 1976. The hitch was in the steps. There was no way for the hitch to be in the steps. He had been cremated. His ashes were in an urn in my sister's hall closet in San Diego. The voice said, "Sammy boy." It said, "Please." It said, "I want to tell you something." It said, "I have been wanting to tell you something." I stood with my weight on the door. There was a rake hung on the inside of the barn. It was an old, wide-headed hay rake on a wooden handle, worn smooth as a sax reed. He had used it every day of his life. After he died, the rake had been left where the coroner had found it, leaning against the post nearest the horse stall where he had died. I had not been in the barn since the funeral. I had not touched the rake. I could hear the handle of the rake scraping across the dirt floor in a slow circle. It was scraping a circle in the dirt, the way you would drag a stick, slow, around and around. It was the height of it. That was when my hand was on the wood, and I could feel the wood vibrate, and the rake handle was scraping the circle, and my father's voice was through the wood saying, "Sammy boy." I pushed off the door. I walked backward through the snow with the flashlight in my hand. The voice did not call me back. The whistling did not start again. The rake handle kept scraping the circle. I walked backward across the yard until I came up against the rental car, and I felt for the door handle without taking my eyes off the barn. And I got in the car, and I started the car, and I drove out of the lane onto the county road, and I drove the 17 miles into Buffalo too fast in the snow. And at the Best Western, I sat in the car in the parking lot for a long time with the engine running and the heat on full. I went into the lobby. I told the clerk I was checking out. She was a young woman, maybe 20, with a name tag that said Cassie. She looked at the snow on my coat and she said, "You all right, sir?" I said I was fine. I checked out. I drove west on Interstate 90 toward home in the snow all night, and I got to my driveway in Spokane at 4 a.m. My wife came out in her robe. She put her arms around me on the porch in the dark. I had not told her I was coming home. She did not ask me anything. She just took me inside. The box of letters is still in the front room of my father's house. The lawyer asked me last month what I wanted to do about the ranch. I told him to hire somebody to clear it out and to put it on the market. The padlock on the barn door has the key in my pocket. I have not given the key back to the lawyer. The padlock is still on the hasp. The deadbolt is still thrown. There has been one thing. About a month ago, I was in the garage at home, in the dark, looking for a wrench. I had a flashlight. I had not turned the overhead on. I could hear my wife in the kitchen, through the connecting door, washing a dish. I was bent down by the toolbox, and I could smell something that should not have been there. It was Camel cigarettes and Pine Sol. I knew that smell. I have known that smell my whole life. I straightened up. I looked at the door to the kitchen. The light was coming through the small gap at the bottom. My wife's shadow was moving back and forth across it. The smell was strong enough that I could taste it. It was right behind me, the way a person is right behind you. The voice was low. It said, "Sammy boy." I did not turn around. I stood there, with the wrench in my hand and the flashlight in my other hand and the smell of him in the air behind me, and I did not turn around. The voice said, "Son." It said, "I want to tell you something." It said, "I have been wanting to tell you something for a long time. I have not gone into the garage at night since my wife asked me about it. She had noticed that I was going down to the basement for tools instead of into the garage. She had noticed that I had moved the toolbox to the back porch. She asked me if I wanted to talk about my father. I said no. She did not push. She is a patient woman. She has been a patient woman for a long time. She told me at dinner one night that she had been driving past the cemetery in Spokane and had thought about my mother, and she had asked me when the last time I had been to my mother's grave was. I had said it had been 20 years. She had nodded. She had not said anything else about it. I drove to the cemetery in Spokane on a Saturday in November. The grass was wet. My mother is buried in a plot in the Riverside Memorial Park on the north side of town. I had not been to the grave since my own wedding, which had been in 2006, when I had brought my wife there to introduce her. I stood at the headstone with my hands in my pockets, and I read the letters of my mother's name out loud. I do not know why I did that. I had not planned to. I said the name, and the air around me went still in a way I cannot put words to. The wet grass at my feet stopped moving. The bare maple branch above me stopped moving. Across the cemetery, a flag on a far pole stopped moving. I stood there in the still air for I do not know how long, and I waited for something to come, and nothing came. I went back to the car. The wind came back up halfway across the lot. I did not look back at the headstone. The cigar box of letters is in my father's front room, and the rake is in his barn, and the deadbolt is thrown on the door, and I have the key in my pocket. I keep the key in the pocket of my jeans. I move it from pair to pair when I do the laundry. I have not opened a letter. I do not know what is in the letters. I will not know what is in the letters. He kept telling me there was something he wanted to tell me. He had 11 years. He had 11 years to put a stamp on one of those envelopes and to walk out to the mailbox at the end of his lane. He did not do it. He had 11 years, and he did not do it, and then he died. And I will be damned if I am going to open a letter or a barn door or a garage door or anything else for a thing that wants to tell me now. I am going to sit in the front room of my own house with my wife and my kids and the lamp on and the door closed, and I am going to keep the key in my pocket. The wind is up outside. The cottonwoods on my own street are bare now. I am keeping the key in my pocket. The lawyer called yesterday and said the cleanout crew had finished. He said the place was ready to list. He said there had been one strange thing. He said the cleanout crew had reported the barn was locked from the inside. There was a deadbolt I had thrown from the outside, with a padlock through the hasp, and he had the spare key from the lawyer's office, and they had opened that, and they had pulled the sliding door, and the sliding door had been wedged shut from the inside, with a length of 2x4 jammed into the track. He said the crew had had to cut it out with a sawzall. I asked him if the rake was inside. He said yes. He said the rake had been against the post. He said there had been a circle scraped into the dirt floor around the post where the rake was leaning, a wide circle. He said it had been pretty clear in the dust. I told him to throw the rake out. He said he would. He said the listing would go up Monday. He said he was sorry for everything. He said he had liked my father. He said my father had spoken about me from time to time in the office when the lawyer had been drawing up the will. He said my father had said good things. I thanked him. I hung up. I am keeping the key in my pocket. The wife at the tent flap. The rifle stock was slick where my hand had been gripping it. I could not feel my fingers, but I could hear them creaking against the wood. Karen's voice came through the tent canvas again, lower this time, the way she said my name when she wanted me to come back to bed. It was not her. I had driven up Saturday morning from Coeur d'Alene with the truck loaded the way my dad used to load his. Heavy stuff against the cab, soft stuff bungeed on top, rifle in its case on the back seat, thermos of coffee on the passenger floorboard. Karen had hugged me in the kitchen before I left. She had said, "Be careful," and I had said, "I always am." And she had given me that look she gives when I have said something we both know is not exactly true. Murphy, our yellow lab, had followed me to the door and stood there with his bad hips and his cloudy eye and watched me carry the rifle out to the truck. 12 years old and going gray around the muzzle. He used to come with me. Now he stood in doorways. The drive was 4 hours up to Hamilton, Montana, and then another hour and a half up the Forest Service roads to where I park. I took my time. There is a stretch on Highway 93 north of Lolo where the river runs hard against the highway and the trees come right up to the shoulder, and the light through the ponderosas in October is the kind of light my dad used to talk about. He died last March of a heart attack while changing the oil in his old Bronco. He was 68, the kind of man who never went to a doctor. There was a lot we did not know about what had been wrong with him until the autopsy. The hunting trips were his thing. He had taken me every year from the time I was 8 until I went into the Marines, and then again after I came out. Karen used to call him my second wife. She had said it as a joke at first, and then for a few years she had not said it as a joke. I had not been up here since he died. The plan had been the two of us this October the way it had been every October. I came alone because I did not know what else to do with the week off. The road in gets worse the farther you go. It starts as gravel, and then it gets to rock, and then it gets to the kind of two-track where you can hear the brush against the underside of the truck for the last mile. I parked at the saddle where the road ends and pulled the gear out and started up the ridge with the pack on my back and the rifle on my shoulder. There is a flat spot about a half-mile in where I have camped 6 or 7 times. A small clearing under a stand of lodgepole pine with a spring about 200 yards down the slope. I put the tent up in the spot where my dad and I had put our tent the last time we were here. I set the tent stakes in the same holes. The first night was quiet. I made dinner on the camp stove, ate it sitting on a log, and watched the light go out of the sky. The temperature dropped fast the way it does at 7,000 feet in late October. I could see my breath by the time I had the dishes washed. The stars came on. I sat there long enough to drink most of a flask of wild turkey my dad had given me for a Christmas. I could not remember which one. And then I went into the tent and zipped myself into the sleeping bag and listened to the wind move through the pines. Sleep came easy. I had not slept hard in months. The marriage was not bad. That part matters. The marriage was not bad. It was the way a marriage gets when two people have been working hard at different things for a long time and have not been paying attention to the in-between. Karen had her kindergarten room. I had the shop at the dealership. Becca had gone off to Boise State the year before, and the house had gotten quiet in a way neither of us had been ready for. Dad dying had taken something else out of me that I had not been able to put back yet. Karen had been waiting for me to come around. I had been telling her I would. The week up here was supposed to be the week I came around. I was not sure how that was going to work, but that had been the idea I had been carrying when I drove up. There had been a fight in August. Not a big fight. A long, quiet kind of fight that ran for a week through the kitchen and the bedroom and the front porch and never quite got to the point of either of us saying what we were actually upset about. It had started over a credit card statement. It had ended with Karen at the kitchen table at 1 a.m. crying, and me on the couch pretending to be asleep so I would not have to go in there and say the things I did not know how to say. Becca had called twice that week. I had not picked up either time. I had told myself I would call her back. I had not. I had been telling myself I would call her back for 2 months when I drove up here. A man can spend a long time on the highway driving away from things he should be driving toward. I had 4 hours of empty road from Coeur d'Alene to the trailhead to think about that, and I did not think about it for a single one of them. I listened to George Strait, and I drank gas station coffee, and I watched the river, and I did not let my head get anywhere near the kitchen table at 1 a.m. I woke at first light and made coffee and ate 2 granola bars while the meadow below the ridge slowly came out of the dark. I had glassed it the evening before and seen sign down at the wallow, but no animals. I sat with the binoculars at the edge of the clearing and watched the meadow and the timber along the far edge and tried to be patient. Patience had been my dad's whole religion. He had told me 1,000 times that hunting was waiting and that any fool could pull a trigger. Around 9, I saw a cow elk step out at the far end of the meadow. She fed for a while at the edge of the timber, looked up once, and went back into the trees. I watched the meadow for another 2 hours and saw nothing else. I made my way down the slope to the spring to refill my water bottles. That was where I saw the track. The spring runs out of a seep at the base of a granite outcrop and pools in a flat patch of mud where a person can squat to fill bottles. The mud holds tracks like wet cement. I had seen elk and deer and coyote and one good bear print there over the years. What I was looking at now was something else. It was the shape of a foot, a bare foot, long and narrow and with toes that had pressed deeper than the heel. The toes were too long. The print was set right at the edge of the pool, deep enough that it had to have been made when the mud was wet, which meant, since the last rain, which meant within the last 2 days, there was just the one print. No others coming in, no others going out, like whatever had made it had stepped down out of the air and then back up into it. I am a mechanic. I work with my hands. I trust what I can measure. I knelt by the print and got out my pocket knife and laid it next to the heel and saw that the print was a good 2 inches longer than the 4-inch blade. I took a picture with my phone, and then I stood up and looked around the clearing and the slope above the spring and saw nothing and heard nothing. And I told myself that whatever had made that track was a hoax some kid had pressed in the mud with a piece of wood. I told myself that twice while I filled the water bottles. I do not know if I believed it. The walk back up to camp felt longer than the walk down. The pack on my back was the same weight. The slope was the same slope. But the woods felt different, the way a room feels different when someone you cannot see is in it. I kept stopping and listening. I did not hear anything but the wind in the pines and a chickadee somewhere up the slope. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was high enough that the frost on the tent fly had melted. I unloaded the water and sat on the log and ate a sandwich. The owl called at noon. I had heard owls 1,000 times. I had heard them in the woods at night and through the kitchen window at home where one used to come to the maple in the side yard. They call at night. That is what they do. The owl that called from the trees at the edge of camp called at exactly 12:07. I know because I looked at my watch the second I heard it. It called 3 more times in the next 20 minutes, each call lower and longer than the one before, and then it stopped. I put it in the same drawer as the track, the drawer where I was keeping the things I did not want to think about. That afternoon I hunted the timber along the south edge of the meadow and saw nothing. On the way back up to camp, I felt cold the way you feel cold when somebody walks behind you in an empty parking lot. I turned around twice. The second time I unslung the rifle and stood there with it in my hands and watched the slope below me for a full 5 minutes. The trees were the trees. The slope was the slope. I went back to camp. Halfway up the ridge, I came across something I did not have a place for. It was about 30 yards off the deer trail, in a small flat space between 2 large pines, and at first I thought it was a piece of orange flagging from a hunter who had marked a kill last season. It was not flagging. It was a strip of cloth, bright orange, about 6 inches long, tied around the trunk of the smaller pine at chest height in a careful double knot, with the ends trimmed even. I knew the cloth. It was the kind my dad used to cut from an old hunter's vest of his and used to mark a downed elk so he could find it again when he came back with the truck. He had a roll of the strips in his glove box for 40 years. I had cut a few of them with him when I was a kid, on the kitchen table with his shears, and he had shown me how to do the double knot so the wind would not work it loose. There were 3 strips left in the roll when he died. I had them in a Ziploc bag in the bottom drawer of my dresser at home. I had checked the bag before I drove up here. All 3 were there. I stood looking at the strip tied to the pine for a long time. I did not touch it. I did not untie it. I walked the rest of the way to camp with my mouth dry and my hand on the rifle. I told myself, a hunter from last fall must have used the same kind of cloth. I told myself the knot looked like 1,000 other knots. I told myself a lot of things on the walk back to camp, and some of them I half believed, and some of them I did not. That night was the smell. I had cooked dinner and washed up and gotten into the tent and read for a while by headlamp. I was reading a paperback Karen had picked up for me at a Goodwill in Spokane, a thick western by Louise L'Amour, about a man who comes home from the Civil War to find his ranch overrun by squatters. I had read the same 5 pages 4 times. My head kept going to the spring. I would force myself back to the book, and then a few minutes later I would be at the spring again, looking down at the print. When the smell came in through the tent flap, I sat up so fast I cracked my head on the rib of the tent. It was lavender. Karen's shampoo. The exact lavender shampoo from the green bottle she had been using for the last 6 years, the one I bought her at the Walgreens on Sherman, because she could never remember to pick up her own. It was so strong it was like the bottle had been broken open under my nose. I sat there with my hand on the top of my head and my heart in my throat and the smell of my wife's hair filling the tent. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, then it was gone. I unzipped the tent and stuck my head out into the cold. The clearing was empty. The pines around it were still. The moon was a hard white circle over the ridge. I could hear my own pulse in my ears and nothing else. I pulled my head back in and zipped the tent shut and got the rifle out of the case and laid it across my legs with the bolt closed on an empty chamber and a round in the magazine. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my back in the sleeping bag with the rifle across my legs and listened. Nothing came. By the time the sky started gray over the eastern ridge, I had convinced myself that I had imagined the smell. I had told myself, "You have been thinking about her. You have been missing her. You have been up here alone for 2 days now, and your dad is dead, and your marriage is whatever it is, and your head is doing what heads do." I drank the coffee shaking. The cup rattled against my teeth. Day 3 was the song. I went down to the meadow at first light and sat at the edge of the timber and glassed and saw nothing. I worked my way around to the west side and sat in a different spot and glassed and saw nothing. The wind shifted at mid-morning, and I gave up on the meadow and walked the timber a little. I was on a deer trail about a half-mile west of camp when I heard somebody whistling. It was a tune I knew. I knew it the way you know a tune that has been part of your life for years without you ever sitting down and learning it. It was the chorus of Strawberry Wine. Karen had loved that song since she was a girl. She had asked the DJ to play it at our wedding reception in the Coeur d'Alene Eagles Lodge in 2008. She still played it when she cleaned the house. There were stretches of our marriage where I had heard that song so many times I could not stand it, and she had laughed at me about it. And we had a thing for a while where I would put my hands over my ears whenever it came on and she would sing it louder. And that was funny to both of us in the way that little dumb things in marriages are funny to both of you. Until one day, they are not. The whistling was up the slope from me, maybe 60 yards into the timber. It was not loud. It was the kind of whistling a man does to himself when he is working. I stood on the deer trail with my rifle in my hands, and I listened to the chorus of Strawberry Wine being whistled from the trees above me by something that was not whistling for me to hear it. It went through the chorus twice, and then it stopped. I did not move. I did not call out. I waited there on the deer trail until the wind picked up enough to cover any sound it might have made, and then I walked very quietly back the way I had come and back up the slope to camp. I did not run. Running would have been wrong. I do not know how I knew that, but I knew. When I got back to the camp clearing, I went straight to my pack and got out my phone and held it up to the sky to see if I could pull a bar of signal. I could not. The ridge above camp was where I could get a bar if I climbed all the way up to the saddle just below the summit. That was a 40-minute climb in good weather. The light was already starting to soften and the wind was picking up out of the northwest, and I knew snow was coming. I made a decision then. I would sleep at camp that night and break camp at first light and hike down to the truck and drive somewhere I could get a signal and call my wife and hear her voice, and then I would decide what I was doing with the rest of my week. The decision settled me a little. I cooked an early dinner and got water on for tea and tried to read the Lemoore and gave up on it. The wind kept rising. I could hear it coming up the slope below the clearing like a slow wave. By full dark, the temperature was in the low 20s, and the first flakes of snow were ticking against the tent fly. I was inside the tent with my boots still on and my coat over my legs when I heard somebody call my name. It came from down the slope, from the direction of the spring. It was a woman's voice, and the voice said, "Tom." It said it the way somebody says your name when they want you to come to them. I sat up in the sleeping bag. The wind blew the tent walls in and out, the way a slow lung breathes. The voice said Tom again, closer. Then it said Tomcat. Tomcat had been Karen's name for me since the second week of college in 2004. She had given it to me at a frat party where I had been drunk enough to climb up on a porch roof and shout at a girl I had been chasing, and Karen had been the girl, and the name had stuck. Nobody else called me that. Nobody else knew it. I had not said it out loud in I do not know how long. There was a stretch of years where Karen had stopped using it. The last time I had heard her say it was the night before I drove up here. In bed, in the dark, her hand on my chest, her voice in my ear. The thing outside the tent, said Tomcat again. Then it laughed. The laugh was wrong. The voice was right. The voice was exactly right. It was Karen, my Karen, the woman I had been married to for 15 years, and the voice was hers, down to the small catch she gets at the back of her throat when she is tired. But the laugh was not her laugh. The laugh was something else, doing what it thought a laugh was, and getting the shape right and the sound wrong, the way a kid will get the shape of a horse right when he draws one, but the legs will all be on the wrong side of the body. I got the rifle out from where I had laid it down. I worked the bolt slow and quiet and chambered around. The lavender came in through the tent flap again, so strong I could taste it. Tomcat, the voice said, come out here, baby. I drove all the way up here to surprise you. I did not say anything. I sat there with the rifle pointed at the tent flap and listened to her tell me to come out. She told me she had brought the dog. She told me she was cold. She told me she had stopped at the gas station in Hamilton and gotten me the kind of jerky I like, the peppered kind, the kind from the wood-fired smoker behind the counter where the guy with the eye patch worked. She told me to please come out because the dog needed to pee, and she did not want to leave him in the truck. Every detail was right. The Walgreens shampoo, the jerky, the guy with the eye patch. She had been with me at that gas station maybe 4 times in our entire marriage. I sat with the rifle, and I did not move, and I did not speak. The voice changed after a while. It went lower. It got patient. It said, please. It said, baby, please. It said I drove all this way. And then there was a long stretch where it did not say anything at all, and I could only hear the wind and the small ticking of snow on the fly and the sound of something I could only call breathing on the other side of the canvas. Heavy, slow breathing, and a small wet sound at the end of each breath, like somebody who has been crying. It said Karen's name then. It said Karen, in Karen's voice, like Karen was calling for herself. I am not going to pretend I was thinking clearly. I had my finger inside the trigger guard. The safety was off. The rifle was pointed at the spot where the voice was. I could have put a round through the tent canvas and through whatever was on the other side. I do not know if it would have done anything. I sat there for what felt like an hour while the breathing went on, and the snow ticked down. Once, only once, something small and hard ran a single finger up the outside of the tent from the floor to the apex, slow, exploratory, like a person feeling for the zipper in the dark. That was the height of it. That was when my hand was so tight on the rifle stock that I could not feel my fingers anymore, and I could hear the wood creaking, and the voice came through the canvas again, lower, the way she said my name when she wanted me to come back to bed. Tomcat, it said. Open the tent. I did not open the tent. The voice did something I could not understand then. It hummed. A few bars of strawberry wine. Low, the way Karen hummed when she was washing dishes. Then it went quiet and stayed quiet for so long I started to believe it was gone, and then it spoke one more time, right against the canvas. The canvas pushed inward a little when it spoke. The breath of the words moved the cloth. I love you, it said. Tomcat, I love you. I did not say anything. I sat there with the rifle pointed at the spot where the breath was, and I did not say anything, and after a while the breathing stopped and the wind came up loud out of the canyon and the snow ticked harder against the fly. The breathing stopped sometime before dawn. I did not know exactly when. I had been listening so hard for so long that the silence had become its own sound. I sat up the rest of the night with the rifle on my knees and watched the gray come into the tent through the fly and waited for the breathing to come back. It did not. When the light was strong enough to see by, I unzipped the tent slow. The clearing was empty. There was snow on the ground, maybe an inch, and the wind had blown most of it off the rocks and the deadfall. There were no tracks anywhere around the tent. There were no tracks coming into the clearing. There were no tracks going out. I packed in 12 minutes. I left the camp stove. I left the Lemoore. I left a Nalgene by the tent stake. I went down the slope with the rifle in my hands and my pack flapping unbuckled, and I did not look at the spring as I passed it. I did not let myself. The truck started on the first turn. I backed it out of the saddle and drove the 2-track down to the forest road too fast, and the road down to Hamilton too fast, and at the first place I had bars, a pull-out above the river south of Darby. I stopped and pulled the phone out with my hands shaking and called Karen. She answered on the second ring. She was at the school. It was a Tuesday morning. She had been about to start her afternoon kindergarten. Murphy was at home asleep on the rug. She had not driven anywhere. She had not been to a gas station. She had not gotten me jerky. She had been in her classroom since 7 that morning. I did not tell her what had happened. I told her I missed her. I told her I was coming home. I told her I loved her. She was quiet a second after I said that. I could hear the kindergarten kids in the background. She said, "Baby." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I was fine." I said, I just wanted to hear her voice. She said she had been thinking about me. She said she had been worried. She said she had woken up at 3 in the morning the night before with a bad feeling, like somebody had been calling her, and she had checked her phone, and it was nothing, but she had lain awake until 5. She told me this in the easy way she tells me things when she does not think they are important. I drove the rest of the way home with the radio off. I did not want any voices in the truck with me. I did not want anybody whistling. I have not told her. It has been 3 months. I have not told Karen what was outside the tent that night, or what was at the spring, or what was whistling in the trees. I have not told her that there are nights when the dog stands at the bedroom door and stares down the hall and growls at nothing, and I lie there in the dark listening, and I am sure, completely sure, that somewhere in the dark of the house something is standing very still and waiting for me to call her name. The other night Karen rolled over in bed and put her hand on my chest. She said, "Tomcat, I want you to know I love you. I want you to know that I have been awake every night since." I lie in the dark, and I listen to her breathe. Murphy will not sleep in the bedroom anymore. He has been sleeping in the hall outside the door for 2 months. I listen to Murphy's claws on the floor when he gets up to drink from his bowl. I listen to the furnace come on. I listen to the wind in the maple in the side yard. I listen to the small sounds of a house at night that I have lived in for 14 years, and I tell myself that I know every one of them. I tell myself that the breathing next to me is hers. And then sometimes Karen will sigh in her sleep, the way she has always sighed, and she will turn over, and her shoulder will come up against mine in the dark, and she will be warm, and she will smell like her shampoo. And I will lie there with my eyes open in the dark of our bedroom, and I will think about the snow ticking on the tent fly, and the breath of the words moving the canvas, and the way the laugh was wrong, but the voice was right. She rolls toward me in the dark, and she says my name, and I do not say anything back. I do not say anything back. I lie there with my eyes open, and I listen to her breathe, and I wait for the laugh. The brother on the radio. I was crouched behind a deadfall on the north side of the saddle with the radio in my left hand and my rifle in my right. The radio was crackling, and then it was not, and the voice that was coming through the speaker was my brother Danny's voice, and Danny had been dead for 12 years, and he was asking me to come down to the saddle alone. The wind had stopped. The trees were moving anyway. The 4 of us had driven up to the Bighorns on a Friday in late October. We did the same trip every year, the same week, in the same trucks, with the same beer in the cooler. Pete drove his black F-250 with the camper shell. Tony rode shotgun and rolled cigarettes off his thigh the whole way up. Dale and I followed in my Tacoma. We had been doing this since 2013. It started the first October after Danny died. Danny had been the one who organized the trip every year before that. After he got killed, I had taken over the trip the way you take over a thing that belongs to somebody you love, badly at first, and then a little better each year. And then after a while, you do not think about it as their thing anymore. You just think about it as the thing you do every year. Pete had been Danny's best friend since the 3rd grade. Tony had been mine since high school. Dale had married into us through a wedding the summer of 1998. The 4 of us were the surviving infield of a life Danny had been the center fielder for, and we got together once a year to drink and to hunt and to not talk about him for 5 straight days. And on the drive home, we would each break and say something about him, and we would crack 1 beer each, and that would be that. The drive up from Sheridan takes about 2 hours. The road goes up over the eastern flank of the Bighorns on the Cloud Peak Highway and drops down into a valley on the west side where there is a Forest Service campground we use as a base camp. From the campground, we hunt the timber up toward a ridge that runs north and south at about 10,000 feet. There is a saddle at the south end of the ridge where the timber thins and the meadow opens out, and that is where we usually push elk. Danny had picked the spot when we were 20 and 22. He had walked it the year before he deployed for the 2nd time. He had drawn me a map on a paper towel at his kitchen table. I still had the paper towel. I had it laminated. It was in my pack the day we drove up. I am an IT guy. I work at a regional bank in Sheridan. I patch servers, and I yell at people about their passwords, and I drink too much coffee, and I go home at 5:30. I am 40. I have a wife, Jess, who teaches 6th grade, and 2 kids, Maddie, who is 10, and Owen, who is 8. Maddie has Danny's chin. There is no reason a niece who never met her uncle should have her uncle's chin, but there it is. I have a photograph of Danny at 12 and a photograph of Maddie at 10, and they have the same chin and the same crooked smile, and I cannot look at the 2 photographs side by side without my chest closing up. Danny was killed by a roadside bomb outside Ramadi on a Tuesday in March of 2013. He was 26. I was 28. He had been an Army Ranger, and he had been on his 4th deployment, and he had been the kind of soldier brothers do not get, and that came to matter later. He was the best at what he did. He had been 3 weeks from coming home for good when it happened. My mother had been packing his old bedroom into boxes the day the chaplain came to her door. The boxes were still in her attic. The funeral had been at the Calvary Lutheran Church on Main Street in Sheridan. There had been an honor guard. There had been the kind of crowd a town gives a soldier who comes home in a box. There had been a flag folded 13 times and handed to my mother in the front pew, and there had been 21 rifle shots at the graveside, and my brother had gone into the ground at the Sheridan Municipal Cemetery on a Monday in March, with the snow still piled at the edges of the dug grave. I had stood at the graveside in a borrowed suit, with my mother on one side and Jess on the other, and I had not cried. I had not cried at the funeral, and I had not cried at the wake, and I had not cried at any point since. And there were people in my family who held that against me, and there were people who did not. And I do not think it had anything to do with what I felt. I just had not cried. The thing about Danny was that he had been a hunter. He had been a better hunter than I am. He had grown up with our dad's old 30-06, and he had killed his first elk at 14, and he had read every Jack O'Connor book in the Sheridan County Library by the time he was 16. The trip to the Bighorns had been his trip. He had planned it the first time when he was 20 and I was 22, on a paper towel at his kitchen table, with the map he had drawn from memory, because he had walked the ridge in 2007 and had not been able to get it out of his head. He had said the saddle was a place where elk wanted to be. He had said an elk would come to the saddle the way a man comes home. He had said it like he had walked into something on that ridge that he had not been able to name, and had liked it, and had been planning to go back. I wear his old Carhartt jacket. It is the brown one he bought in 2004 at the ranch and home in Sheridan. It is older than Maddie, and it does not quite fit me anymore. It has a hole in the right pocket where his pocket knife wore through. There is a stain on the left sleeve I have never asked my mother about. I wear it every year on the hunt because Pete told me once that he liked seeing it in camp and it made him feel like Danny was there. We got up to the campground around 3 in the afternoon on Friday, and we set up the wall tent and we got a fire going and we started in on the beer. Pete cooked the elk burgers from last year's freezer stash. Dale told the same Wyoming Highway Patrol story he had been telling for 15 years. Tony rolled cigarettes and listened. I sat on a log and watched the light go down on the west slope of the ridge. The plan was to be in our spots by first shooting light Saturday morning. We had hunted the ridge enough times that we did not need to talk about it. Pete would take the timber stand at the north end. Tony would push from the east through the burn. Dale would sit at the south overlook above the meadow. I would walk the saddle. I had been walking the saddle for 10 years. It was Danny's old spot. Saturday morning we were up at 4. Coffee. Granola bars. Boots laced in the dark. We split up at the trail junction below the ridge and went to our spots and turned our radios on and stood with our hands in our pockets and watched the sky go from black to gray to gold. I was on the saddle by 6. I sat down behind a deadfall on the north edge and laid the rifle across the log and waited. About an hour in, when the sun was just clearing the eastern ridge and the light was coming flat across the saddle, I noticed something on the deadfall. It was about 6 feet to my left. A small carving in the bark, 2 letters and a date. The letters were DR. The date was the year Danny had walked the ridge for the first time, 2007. I had not noticed it before. I had sat behind this deadfall 100 times. I had hunted off this log every October for 10 years. I had eaten lunch on this log. I had taken a leak 10 feet from this log. I had never seen the carving. The bark around it was old. The wood inside the cuts was gray. It was not a fresh carving. It looked like it had been there for years. I sat there with the rifle across the log, and I looked at the carving for a long time. The light moved on it. The letters were Danny's letters. He had a particular way of making a D. The bottom of the D went down past the line. I told myself a lot of things. I told myself Danny had carved it on his scouting trip in 2007. I told myself he had told me about it and I had forgotten. I told myself it had always been there and I had only just noticed it because of the angle of the light. I told myself those things and I sat there with my hand on the rifle and I watched the meadow and I tried to hunt. Around 10, I worked my way back down the ridge to camp for lunch. I did not tell Pete about the carving. I did not tell anybody about the carving. I ate Pete's sandwich, and I drank a Coke, and I went back up. The first day, I did not see anything. That was not unusual. The elk on this ridge had been hunted for 140 years. They knew when guns were in the timber. They came out at dusk to feed in the meadow at the south end of the ridge, and a man sitting on the saddle could go a whole day without seeing one of them. By dark Saturday, we were back at camp, and Pete had not seen anything either, and Tony had not seen anything either, and Dale had seen one cow at last light and had not had a clean shot. We ate Pete's chili, and we drank beer, and we went to bed. Sunday morning was the same. I sat on the saddle from 6 until 10, and I saw 2 does and a coyote. I walked back to camp for lunch. Pete had a sandwich and a beer waiting for me. We did not talk much. Hunting weeks are quiet weeks. Round 2, I went back up. I took a different angle this time. I went up the east flank of the ridge through the burn from the 2019 fire, where the standing dead lodgepoles creak in the wind, even on a still day, and I came up onto the saddle from above instead of from the south. The saddle was empty when I got to it. It was 4 o'clock. The light was already starting to go. I had about 2 hours of shooting light left. I crouched behind the deadfall I had been at the morning before and got the binoculars up and started glassing the meadow at the south end. The meadow was empty too. I sat for a while. The wind was up. It was blowing out of the west, which was bad because anything coming into the meadow from the south would smell me at the saddle. Around 4:30 I saw movement at the north edge of the meadow. I got the glass on it. It was a young bull. He was a 5-point, broken at the brow tine on one side, with a hide that was already losing its rut color. He stepped out of the timber and stopped about 300 yards from where I was sitting. He stood there. He did not feed. He looked up at the saddle. He looked at me. I have hunted that meadow for 10 years. I have watched elk in that meadow at 300 yards through 8x42s 100 times. I have never seen an elk look at the saddle the way that bull looked at the saddle. He was looking right at me. His eyes had me. His ears were not flicking. He was not turning his head. He was standing in the meadow at 300 yards, and he was looking directly at the spot behind the deadfall where I was crouched. He walked toward me. A young bull, at the end of October, does not walk toward a man with a rifle. He turns and goes back into the trees. He walked at me, across the meadow, straight line, like he had been called. I put the binoculars down and I lifted the rifle and I put the crosshairs on him at 200 yards and I started to slide the safety off, and then I stopped and I did not slide the safety off because the bull's eyes were wrong. They were not the eyes of an elk. I cannot say what they were. They were not the eyes of any animal I had ever seen. They were on the head of an elk. They were looking at me out of the head of an elk. They were the eyes of a person looking at me through the head of an elk like a man looks through the window of a car. I lowered the rifle slow. The bull stopped about 100 yards from the saddle. He turned his head sideways and let his tongue come out and let it hang there. Then he laughed. He laughed. The laugh came out of his mouth around the tongue. It was a sound a person would make if you grabbed him by the throat. It was a wet, rasping kind of sound that had the shape of a laugh inside it. The bull turned and walked back across the meadow at the same pace he had walked toward me, slow, in a straight line, and he walked into the timber at the north edge of the meadow, and he was gone. I did not move for a long time. The radio on my hip crackled. I jumped. It was Pete. He was calling for a check-in. We did them every couple of hours from our spots. I keyed the mic, and I said clear in my voice, the way I always said it. Pete came back. Clear, he said. Tony came back. Clear. Dale came back. Clear. Pete said, see you at camp at full dark. The radio went quiet. The sun was sliding down behind the western ridge. The light in the meadow was going copper. I should have left the saddle then. I should have walked back to camp. I should have left. I stayed because the bull had laughed at me, and I had not done anything about it, and I was angry. I sat behind the deadfall and I waited to see if the bull would come back. I sat there for 40 minutes. The light went the rest of the way down. The shadows on the meadow got long. I could not see across to the north edge anymore. The radio crackled again. It was not Pete. The crackle was wrong. It was longer than a key up. It had a low hum behind it. Then a voice came through. Mikey, the voice said. I did not move. Mikey, it said again. Bro, you there? There was nobody on the trip who called me Mikey. Pete called me Mike. Tony called me Mike. Dale called me Mike. Jess called me Mike. My mother called me Michael. The only person who had ever called me Mikey was Danny. He had called me Mikey since he was 6 and I was 8. He had called me Mikey when he was angry, and Mikey when he was kidding, and Mikey when he was scared. He had called me Mikey from a satellite phone in a hut outside Ramadi 9 days before he got killed. That had been the last time anybody had ever called me Mikey. I keyed the mic and I said, this is Mike. I said, who is this? The voice came back. Mikey, it said. Come down to the saddle. I am at the saddle, I said. Who is this? Come down to the south side, the voice said. The radio went off. I held it in my hand. The wind had died. I could hear my own breath. The voice was Danny's voice. It was his voice the way he had spoken when he was excited. There had been a way he ran his words together when something good was about to happen. The voice on the radio had that. It was him. It was him down to the small whistle in his sinus from the time he broke his nose at 16. I sat behind the deadfall, and I waited. The radio crackled again. Pete's voice came through. Check in, Pete said. Pete sounded like Pete. Pete was Pete. Clear, I said. Tony came back clear. Dale came back clear. You all right, Mike? Pete said. You sound funny. I said I was fine. I said I was packing up. I said I would meet them at camp. Pete said, okay. The radio went quiet. I started to gather my gear. My hands were shaking, and I dropped the binocular case and had to crouch down for it. When I came back up, the radio was crackling again, and Danny's voice was coming through, and it was lower this time, like he was hiding from somebody. Mikey, it said. Don't tell them. Just come down. I need to talk to you. Bro, I need to tell you something. Where are you? I said. I'm at the South Overlook, the voice said. Dale's not here. Dale went back. I'm here. Come down. Dale was at the South Overlook. Dale had checked in at the South Overlook 1 minute ago. The voice said, "Mikey, please." The voice said, "I have been trying to get to you for so long." The voice said, "Please come, Mikey. Please come down before they take me back." I am not going to pretend I was thinking. I do not know if I was thinking. I sat there with the radio in my hand and the rifle across my knees, and I felt my brother's voice come into my ear, and I felt 12 years of something I had not let myself look at come up the back of my throat. He had been 26. He had been 3 weeks from coming home. He had been my little brother. He had called me Mikey. He had called me Mikey from a satellite phone in a hut outside Ramadi. He was on the radio asking me to come down to the South Overlook alone. The trees on the saddle started to move. There was no wind. There had been wind earlier, out of the west, and the wind had died at full dark, the way mountain wind does. The trees were still, and then they were not. The lodge poles around the saddle started to sway, not in a circle, not in a wave, the way wind moves trees. They were moving one at a time. The tree on my left would sway over, and then it would come back up, and the tree behind me would sway over and come back up, and the tree on my right would sway over and come back up. In a rhythm, in a slow circle around the saddle, like a thing walking past them and pushing them aside as it came. The radio said, "Mikey, please." I put the radio in my coat pocket, and I picked up the rifle, and I left the saddle. I did not go down to the South Overlook. I went north. I went off the deer trail and through the burn and down the east flank of the ridge in the dark, with the rifle in one hand and the other hand out in front of me and my heart in my throat. I went down through the standing dead at half a run, banging my shins on deadfall, falling once and getting back up. I did not turn the headlamp on. I do not know why I did not turn the headlamp on. The headlamp was on the strap around my neck. I just did not turn it on. I went down the east flank of the ridge in the dark for 40 minutes until I came out on the Forest Service road below camp, and then I walked the road to camp with the headlamp still off, and I came into camp at full dark. Pete was at the fire. He had a beer in his hand. He looked up when I came into the light. "Where the hell have you been?" he said. "We were about to come look for you." Dale was at the cooler, getting another beer. Tony was sitting on a log, rolling a cigarette. 3 of them. 3 of us at the fire. I sat down on the log next to Tony. I put the rifle on the ground. My hands were shaking. I tried to hide it. I put my hands in the pockets of the Carhartt and I sat there. Pete said, "Mike, you all right?" I said I was fine. I said the elk had spooked at the saddle, and I had gone down the east side instead of the south. I said I had not turned the headlamp on. I said I had not heard anything on the radio. I said it like I was reading off a card. Pete looked at me a long time. He did not say anything else. He handed me a beer. I cracked it. I drank. After a while, Pete went into the wall tent. He came out about a minute later. He was carrying my radio. He had picked it up off the ground next to where I had set the rifle. He held it out to me. "This thing has been off," he said. "The battery is out." He held the radio up so I could see the back. The battery cover was off. The battery was not in it. The little spring contact was empty. The radio was dead. I had been carrying a dead radio on my hip for the last 40 minutes of light. I sat at the fire that night, and I did not drink any more. I did not eat. Pete tried twice to get me to eat. I said I was not hungry. I lay down in the wall tent around 10, with my boots still on, and my hand on the rifle, and I lay there with my eyes open, and I listened to the rest of them at the fire. Around 11, Pete came in. He pulled his boots off, and he got into his sleeping bag. He lay there in the dark. "Mike," he said, after a while. "Yeah, did you hear something out there?" I did not answer right away. I lay there in the dark, with my eyes open. "What did you hear?" I said. Pete did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Never mind." He said, "Get some sleep." We packed up at first light Monday, 2 days early. None of us said anything about it. Tony said maybe weather coming in. Dale said the elk were not running good this year. Pete did not say anything. We took down the wall tent, and we put the gear in the trucks, and we drove out, Pete and Tony in the F-250, me and Dale in the Tacoma. Halfway down the Cloud Peak Highway, Dale said, "Mike." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you mind if I tell you something?" I said, "No, go ahead." He said his ex-wife had been calling him on the radio the whole afternoon. He had been at the South Overlook with the radio off because he did not want to bother us with checks, and the radio had still been talking. He had heard her voice clear as day. She had been asking him to come back to the truck. She had been asking him to come down off the ridge. She had been telling him things only she would have known. She had been asking him to come find her. Dale's ex-wife had died of breast cancer in 2018. Dale drove the rest of the way down with his hands at 10 and 2, and he did not look at me. When we got to Sheridan, he dropped me at my house, and he said, "See you next year, Mike," and he drove off, and I have not heard from Dale since. He did not show up the next year. He did not show up the year after that. Pete called him for a while. Pete stopped calling him. We do not do the trip anymore. Pete and Tony still come over to my house for the third week of October. We sit in my garage and we drink beer, and we do not talk about it. We do not talk about Danny either, the way we used to do on the drive home, the way we used to crack a beer each. None of us has said his name out loud in 3 years. I drove out to the cemetery in May. The grass was just coming in. Danny's stone is a flat granite plate next to my father's. I stood there with my hands in the pockets of his old Carhartt, and I looked at the stone for a long time. I did not say anything to him. I did not bring flowers. I did not pray. I just stood there. After a while, I heard a small sound behind me, like somebody clearing their throat, and I turned around and the cemetery was empty. The grass was empty. The path was empty. There was nobody there. I walked back to the truck and I drove home. Last fall, Jess put a new battery in the radio. She found it in a box in the garage. She did not know what it was. She put a battery in it because she thought it was one of the kids' walkie-talkies. She set it on the kitchen counter while she made dinner. It crackled on. There was a voice on it. I came in from the garage, and the voice was Danny's voice. He was saying, "Mikey, please." Jess turned the radio off. She has not asked me about it. I keep the radio in a drawer in the workbench. The battery is out. I check the drawer every morning before I leave for work. I check it at night before I go to bed. The radio's in the drawer. The battery is out. Last night I was at the workbench past 11. I had a beer in my hand, and I was looking at a chainsaw chain I had been planning to sharpen. The radio in the drawer crackled. I stood there at the workbench in the dark of the garage with the chainsaw on the bench in front of me and the beer in my hand and the radio in the drawer crackling. "Mikey," the radio said. "Bro, I am still standing here. The beer is warm. The chainsaw is in front of me. The radio is in the drawer. I have not opened the drawer. I am not going to open the drawer. I am just going to stand here." "Mikey," the radio says. "Mikey, come on, open it. Come on, Mikey, it's me." The garage is quiet. The light is on over the workbench. I can hear my own breath. I can hear the furnace come on inside the house. I can hear Jess and the kids asleep upstairs. "Mikey," my brother says, in his voice, in the voice he had when he was 6. The voice in the drawer changes a little. It gets the way it used to get when he was small and he had been crying and he was trying to stop. "Mikey," it says, "I'm cold, Mikey. I want to come inside. I want to see Maddie. I want to see Maddie's chin." I do not know how it knows about Maddie's chin. The chin is Danny's chin. She was born with it. The midwife had handed her to Jess, and Jess had looked at her face and said, "Your brother." Jess had never met Danny. The chin is the kind of thing only family would know to look for. The voice in the drawer goes quiet for a long time. Then it says my full name, Michael Robert, the way our mother used to call us in for dinner. The voice is hers now. Then it is back to Danny. Then it is the chaplain from the day at the door. Then it is mine. It says, my own voice back to me. It says, "Please." I am standing at the workbench. I am not opening the drawer. The daughter on the stairs. I was on my knees in the upstairs hallway with my back against the wall and my phone in my hand, and the flashlight on my phone was dying. The small bare footsteps were coming down the hall toward me, one at a time, the way Lila walked when she was sleepy and trying not to fall. The voice was hers. "Daddy, I'm thirsty," it said. The light on my phone flickered. I held my breath. Lila was 400 miles south, asleep in her own bed, with my wife in the room next door. I had rented the lake house through a website Sarah had found for me. It was a one-story log cabin with a small loft, sitting on the south shore of a kettle lake in the Pigeon River country, about an hour and a half north of Grayling. The website had used words like rustic and secluded that always made me suspicious, but the pictures had checked out, and the road in had been drivable in the rental car, and the cabin had been exactly the kind of place I needed. One main room downstairs, with a wood stove, and a kitchen table I could put my laptop on. A small bedroom downstairs I never went into, and a sleeping loft up a steep stairway behind the kitchen. The lake came right up to the back deck. The nearest other cabin was a mile around the shore. I was up there to finish a script. I had been working on it for 14 months. It was a horror movie. It was the third draft, and the producer's notes had been long and contradictory, and my agent had told me to take 2 weeks somewhere where I could not get distracted, and that I should not come back until I had a draft ready to show. I had argued with Sarah about it for a week. I had been gone too much that fall. Lila had been at the age where she noticed when I was not at dinner. Sarah had been working 2 days a week at the dental practice. The math was not working. We needed the script to sell. The script was not going to sell from my home office because I had been trying to write it from my home office for 14 months, and every time I sat down to write, the doorbell rang or the dryer beeped or Lila came in with a Polly Pocket and asked me to put its little plastic shoes on. I had driven up on a Sunday morning, 8 hours. Sarah had walked me to the car. Lila had been at the bay window holding Mooney by one ear. Mooney was a brown stuffed bear about the size of a loaf of bread, with eyes that had been sewn back on after Biscuit chewed them off when Lila was 2, and a missing left arm that Sarah had stitched closed. Lila slept with Mooney every night. Mooney went everywhere with Lila. Mooney was at the bay window in Lila's hand when I pulled out of the driveway. I waved at her. She did not wave back. She was sucking the corner of Mooney's ear. The cabin smelled like cedar and old smoke when I came in. There was a basket of split birch by the wood stove, and a mason jar of matches on the mantel, and the kind of bedspread on the loft bed that grandmothers had been making in this country since the 1800s. There was a small framed photograph on the dresser of a woman in a sun hat holding a fish, and the woman was smiling, and the fish was a smallmouth bass and was dead. I set my duffel down by the wood stove and stood at the window and looked at the lake. There is a particular quality of light that comes off a lake in the late afternoon in October when the wind has died and there is no boat traffic and the maples have already gone red and the lake is still warm enough to be glassy. The cabin had the window oriented for that light. I stood there for a long time before I unpacked. I worked all of Monday and most of Tuesday and got the cold open done, which was the thing the producer had said was the main problem with the second draft. I FaceTimed Sarah Monday night and Tuesday night. Lila came on the screen both times and showed me a leaf she had picked up from the front yard. The leaves were starting to turn at home, too. By Tuesday night, she had a small pile of leaves on the floor of her room, and she counted them for me on the call. 23 leaves. She held up Mooney to say goodnight, and I told her goodnight and Mooney goodnight, and Sarah told me to drink water and to eat actual food and not just the bag of pretzels she had seen me pack. Wednesday morning, I went out on the deck with my coffee at first light. Mooney was sitting on the dock. He was sitting on the second board from the end, upright, both arms out, or his one arm plus the empty cloth, where the other arm had been. The empty cloth was out the same way the arm was out. I stood in the open door of the cabin with my coffee cup in my hand, and I looked at the bear sitting on the dock at 6:15 in the morning, 400 miles from where the bear was supposed to be. I did not move for a long minute. Then I set the coffee down on the deck rail and walked across the dock and picked the bear up. It was Mooney. I do not know how to say it any other way. It was him, Same brown fur, rubbed down to the cloth in the spot above the right eye where Lila held him when she was nervous. Same crooked black thread where the left arm had been. Same smell. Lila's hair smelled like a particular brand of detangler. We got in a yellow bottle from the Target near our house, and the bear smelled like Lila's hair. Exactly the way the bear always smelled. I had washed Mooney in the sink once, when Lila had thrown up on him, and Sarah had been furious about it because the detangler smell had come out of the bear, and Lila had been inconsolable for 2 weeks until the smell came back. The bear in my hand smelled the way it had smelled before I washed it. I sat down on the dock with the bear in my hand and I stared at the lake. I had locked the cabin door the night before. I had checked it twice. I had been the only person on the property since I arrived on Sunday. There were no tire tracks on the gravel drive other than my rental cars. The mile of shore on either side of the cabin was empty. There was no boat in the boathouse next door. The wind off the lake was the only sound. I went back inside and called Sarah on the cell phone, which I had to walk up to the road for to get signal. It was 6:30 at home. She answered groggy. I asked her if Lila was in bed. She said of course she was. I asked her if she could go check. She asked me what was wrong. I said it was a long story, but could she go check? She got out of bed. I could hear her walking down the hall. The door to Lila's room opened. There was a pause. Sarah said Lila was asleep. I asked her if she had Mooney. Sarah said yes. Sarah said the bear was in her arms, the way it always was. I asked her if she was sure. She got a little sharp then. She said, Adam, the bear is in her arms. I am looking at it. I did not tell her about the dock. I told her I had a bad dream. I told her I loved her. I told her I was going to do another 4 hours and then go for a walk. I sat in the cabin with the bear on the kitchen table next to my laptop for the rest of the morning, and I did not write a word. The bear sat across from me with its arms out. After lunch, I picked it up and put it in the bottom drawer of the dresser in the small bedroom downstairs, and I closed the drawer, and I closed the door of the bedroom, and I sat back down at the kitchen table. Wednesday afternoon, I drove into Vanderbilt for groceries. There was no cell signal from the cabin, and the drive took 40 minutes round trip. When I got back, the cabin door was closed and locked, the way I had left it, and the bear was in the drawer in the closed room. I checked. I had to check. The bear was in the drawer. I closed the drawer, and I closed the door of the room, and I went back to my laptop. I worked until 10, and then I climbed up to the loft and went to bed. There was a small glass of water on the nightstand when I woke up. It was 3:46 in the morning. I know because the cabin had one of those wind-up alarm clocks with luminous dials, and I had looked at the dial when I woke up because something had woken me up, and the glass of water had been there on the nightstand right next to the clock. A small glass, the kind of small juice glass we used for Lila at home, the ones with the cartoon strawberries on them. There were no glasses like that in the cabin. I had brought 2 coffee mugs and a Camelback. There were 2 mason jars in the kitchen cupboard and 4 wine glasses and 3 pint glasses and 0 juice glasses with strawberries on them. The glass on the nightstand was a Lila glass. I sat up in the bed in the loft, and I looked at the glass. The water in it was half drunk. The light from the wind-up clock was just enough to see the level, about half. The way Lila drank from a glass, 2 sips, and then she got bored. I picked up the glass. The water was room temperature. The glass was sticky on the bottom, the way Lila's glasses were always sticky on the bottom, because she did not understand how a coaster worked. I did not sleep again that night. I lay in the loft with the glass on the floor next to the bed, and I listened to the cabin. I listened to the wind in the pines off the lake. I listened to the small clicks the wood stove made as it cooled. I listened to my own pulse in my ears. At one point, around 5, I thought I heard somebody walk across the floor downstairs, just 1 or 2 steps. But when I came down at first light, the cabin was empty and the door was locked and the bear was in the drawer. I was going to leave. By Thursday morning, I had made the decision to leave. I had packed the duffel. I had put my laptop in the laptop bag. I had been about to walk out the door when I thought of the bear in the dresser drawer and the glass on the nightstand and the way the dock had been empty when I went out to it, and I had thought, If I drive away now, I am going to spend the rest of my life wondering. I am going to spend the rest of my life thinking I am crazy. The producer's deadline is Monday. I have 3 days. I am going to finish the cold open in the first act, and I am going to leave on Saturday morning with a draft. That was the decision. I made it. Thursday I worked. I sat at the kitchen table from 7 in the morning until 7 at night with 2 breaks for the bathroom and 1 break to make myself a sandwich. I wrote 23 pages. They were not good pages, but they were pages. I did not look at the door of the small bedroom. I did not go down to the dock. I did not look at the lake. Around 2 in the afternoon, I got up to refill my coffee and stretched my back, and on the way back to the table, I walked past the open door of the loft stairway, and something on the bottom step caught my eye. I bent down. It was a single long red hair. Lila has red hair. Not auburn, not strawberry blonde. Red. The way her grandmother on Sarah's side had it, the way her great-grandmother had it. The hair on the step was long, about 10 inches, the length of Lila's hair, when Sarah brushed it out at night. Sarah had been after me to cut it for a year. Lila would not let her. I picked the hair up. It was a real hair, not synthetic, not from a doll. I could feel the small bend at the root where it had been attached to something. I stood there at the bottom of the loft stairs, holding the hair between my finger and my thumb, and I made myself put it down on the kitchen table next to my laptop. I sat back down. I tried to keep writing. A few minutes later, I noticed there was another hair on the floor near my chair. By the time I went to bed, there had been 3. I had put them all on a piece of paper on the kitchen table next to the laptop. 3 long red hairs of the exact color and length and texture of my daughter's hair in a cabin 400 miles from where my daughter was, with no other person in the building. I left them on the paper. I told myself I would look at them in the morning. I told myself a lot of things on Thursday afternoon, and they all sounded fine until I tried to say them out loud. And then they sounded like the kind of things a man says to himself before he does something he will not be able to undo. I went up to the loft at 10. I lay on top of the covers with my clothes on. The little glass of water from the night before was still on the floor next to the bed. I had not moved it. I had not been able to make myself touch it. I lay there in the dark of the loft and I listened to the cabin breathe, and after maybe an hour I fell asleep in the way you fall asleep when you are too tired to be afraid anymore. When I woke up around midnight, there was a long red hair on the pillow next to my face. I did not move. I lay there with my eyes open, and I looked at the hair. The pillow next to mine had a small indentation in it, the size and shape of a child's head. The hair was lying across it. The pillowcase smelled like the detangler from the yellow bottle. I got out of the bed without moving the pillow. I went downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, and I waited for the sun to come up. The sun did not come up for 5 hours. That night the humming started. It was a tune. It was a little tune I had been making up to sing to Lila since she was a baby. It did not have words. It had 8 notes. I had been singing it to her for so long that I did not think of it as a tune anymore. It was just the sound of getting Lila to sleep. Sarah had a tune. I had a tune. Lila knew them both. The 8 notes of my tune were what I hummed to her in the dark of her bedroom when she would not stop crying. They were what I had hummed to her in the hospital when she was 3 days old and would not nurse. They were what I hummed when I rocked her at 3 in the morning in the recliner in the living room. I had never sung the tune to anybody else. Not to Sarah, not to my friends, not to anybody. The tune was mine and Lila's. It was coming from the loft. I had come downstairs to get a glass of water and was standing at the sink, and the tune was coming from up the stairs behind the kitchen. 8 notes. Then 8 notes again. Soft, the way I hummed it. The exact same little catch I always put on the 5th note. 8 notes again. I stood at the sink with the glass of water in my hand, and the tap still running, and I listened to my own private lullaby being hummed to me from the loft I had been sleeping in for 4 nights. I turned off the tap. I went to the kitchen table and got my car keys. I went to the front door of the cabin. The door was locked from the inside. I unlocked it. I opened it. I stepped out onto the porch. The lake was black under a sky with no moon. The wind was up. I could hear the maples shifting on the slope above the cabin. I went back inside. I do not know why I went back inside. I have asked myself that ever since, and I do not have an answer. Part of me thinks I needed to know. Part of me thinks I had been wanting to write a horror movie for so long that some sick, stupid part of me wanted to see what was up the stairs. Part of me thinks something else made me come back in. I do not know. I closed the door behind me. I locked it. The humming had stopped. The kitchen was still. The wood stove ticked. The water glass I had been pouring was on the counter, half full. I picked it up. I drank it. I set it back down. I stood at the bottom of the stairs to the loft, and I listened. A small voice said, "Daddy." It said "Daddy" the way Lila said "Daddy" when she had been asleep and woken up and wanted me to come in. It said, "Daddy, I'm thirsty." I did not say anything. It said, "Daddy, please." The voice was coming from the top of the stairs. I went up. I do not know why. I went up. I had my phone in my hand. I turned the flashlight on. The light from the small kitchen lamp downstairs did not reach the loft. I climbed the steep stairs one at a time and got to the top and stood on the loft floor with my phone light on the bed. The bed was empty. The covers were thrown back the way I had left them. The little glass of water was still on the floor by the bed where I had set it down the night before. The voice was behind me. "Daddy," it said. I turned. The loft was small enough to see all of in one glance. There was the bed. There was the small dresser. There was the door to the half bath. The door was open. The half bath was empty. There was no other place in the loft for a person to stand. The voice was behind me again. "Daddy, I'm thirsty. Daddy, please." It was in the hallway. The little hallway between the top of the stairs and the bed. I turned again, and I held the phone up, and the light from the phone was already dying because I had been using it as a flashlight on and off for 4 days, and the battery was at 4%. The footsteps started. Small, bare footsteps. The pat, pat, pat sound of a 4-year-old in pajama feet on a wood floor. Coming down the hall from the bathroom door, even though I had just looked at the bathroom door and there had been nobody there. Coming down the hall toward me. Step, 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 slow, the way Lila walked when she was half asleep. I sat down. I do not remember sitting down. My knees just went. I was on the floor of the loft hallway with my back against the wall and my phone in my hand, and the flashlight on my phone was dying. The footsteps stopped about 3 feet in front of me. The voice said, "Daddy." It said it right at the level my face was at, since I was sitting on the floor. The voice was so close I could feel a small movement of air against my cheek when it spoke. "Daddy," the voice said. "I want some water." I did not say anything. I did not look up. My phone flashlight died. "Daddy," it said. "Please." I did not move. I sat there in the dark of the loft hallway with my back against the wall, and I closed my eyes and I waited. "Daddy." After a while, it stopped saying my name. After a while, the footsteps started up again and went back down the hallway, slow, the way they had come. I heard them go all the way back to where the bathroom door was. I did not hear the bathroom door open or close. The footsteps just stopped. I sat on the floor in the dark until the cabin started to get light in the windows downstairs. Then I got up. I went down the stairs slow with my hand on the railing. I picked up my duffel and my laptop bag and my keys, and I went out the door of the cabin, and I got in the rental car and I drove. I did not stop for gas until I was past Saginaw. I did not call Sarah until I was halfway home. The bear was in the dresser drawer back in the cabin. I had not gone back into that bedroom for it. I had left it there. I had not been able to put my hand on the knob. Sarah was up. She picked up on the first ring. "Adam," she said, "where are you?" I said I was coming home. She asked if I had finished the draft. I said no. She did not say anything for a second, and then she said, "Okay." She said, "Okay, baby." She said, "Come home." I asked her how Lila was. She said Lila was fine. She said Lila was at the kitchen table eating cereal. She said, "Do you want to talk to her?" I said yes. There was a sound of the phone being moved. There was a small voice. "Hi, Daddy," the voice said. I did not say anything for a second. "Hi, Daddy," the voice said again. I told everyone afterward that I said hi back to her. I told everyone. I told her I missed her. I told everyone. I told her I would be home that night and that we would have spaghetti the way she liked it, with the little meatballs. I drove the last 6 hours with the radio off and the cell phone in the cup holder. Lila was happy when I got home. She ran out the door before I had the car in park and threw her arms around my leg. She was holding Mooney. I picked her up and held her against my chest, and I did not look down at the bear. I held her, and I held her, and Sarah came out of the house and put her arms around both of us and stood there in the yard like that for a long time. Lila got bored and squirmed out of my arms after a while. She ran back inside to show me a picture she had made. That was 2 months ago. I have not finished the script. The producer pulled it. I told my agent I needed some time. He said okay. I told Sarah I was going to take a few months off from writing and just be at home, and she said, "Okay, baby, whatever you need." She did not ask. She knows something happened up there, and she has not asked, and I have been grateful for that, the way you are grateful for somebody not asking about a thing you cannot talk about. Lila has been sleeping with us. We did not plan that. She just started coming into our bed about a week after I got back, and Sarah and I did not say anything to each other about it. We just made room. She sleeps between us with Mooney under her arm. She is a good sleeper. She does not move much. Sometimes in the night, I wake up and look at her face in the dim light from the hall, and she will be there, with her mouth a little open, and the bear under her arm, and her hair across her cheek. A few nights ago she sat up in the dark. She did it slow. She did not say anything. She was sitting up next to me in the bed with the bear in her lap, and she was facing the door of the bedroom, and she was looking at something. Her eyes were open. I could see them in the hall light. She was looking at the door of the bedroom, and she was not blinking. I said, "Honey." I said, "Baby." I said, "What is it?" She did not answer. She kept looking at the door. After about a minute, she lay back down, pulled Mooney to her chest, and closed her eyes and went to sleep. I have not slept in our bed since. I sit in the recliner in the living room, and I keep the lamp on, and I listen. I listen to the furnace come on. I listen to the car go by on the street out front. I listen for footsteps. I listen for the small voice asking for water. Sometimes Sarah comes out around 3 in the morning in her robe and stands in the doorway and looks at me and does not say anything and goes back to bed. The bear is still in the drawer at the cabin. I never canceled the rental. I think about it sometimes. I think about that bear sitting in that drawer. I think about the empty arm where the empty arm should be. I think about the 8 notes of the lullaby and the way they sounded coming down the stairs. I think about the rental agent. She had been a woman named Kathy who had emailed me the door code and asked me to leave a review and asked me to wipe out the wood stove when I left. And I had not wiped out the wood stove because I had left at 6 in the morning without thinking about it. And Kathy had emailed me twice in the weeks after asking if everything had been all right because the cleaners had said the place was strange. She had not used the word strange in her email, but I could tell that was the word she meant. The cleaners had said the loft bed had a child's hair on it, which was not unusual because families rented the cabin, but the cleaners had also said there was a child's glass on the nightstand that had not come from the cabin's kitchen, and a stuffed bear in the bottom drawer of a closed room nobody had used. Kathy had asked if the bear belonged to my daughter. She had said she would mail it to me if it did. I did not respond to the email. A few minutes ago, while I have been sitting here in this chair, I heard Lila's voice from down the hall. It was so small I almost missed it. It said, "Daddy, I am sitting in the chair. I have not gotten up. I am listening. Sarah is in the bedroom. Lila is in the bedroom with Sarah. I can hear Sarah breathing on the baby monitor we still have because we have not put it away yet. 2 sets of breathing, Sarah's and Lila's. I am listening to both of them through the little speaker on the kitchen counter, and I am not getting up. The voice down the hall is saying, "Daddy" again. It says, "Please, I am going to sit here. I am going to sit here in this chair with the lamp on. I am going to sit here until the sun comes up and Sarah comes out in her robe, and I am going to keep the lamp on, and I am going to listen to the two of them breathing on the monitor, and I am not going to get up. I am not going to get up. I can hear the furnace come on. I can hear Sarah turn over in our bed. I can hear the small clock on the kitchen counter, and the refrigerator hum, and the wind in the maple in the front yard. The lamp on the side table is on. The room is full of soft yellow light. The hallway is dark. There is no one in the hallway. There is no voice in the hallway. There is no one calling me. I am sitting in this chair. The mother at the door. The chair was wedged against the door, and I had the deer rifle across my knees. And outside, on the porch, my mother was asking me to let her in. She said, Davy, please, I am so cold. My mother had been dead for 9 years. My name is David Whitlock. I am 50 years old this December. I did 20 years in the Navy and pulled the pin at 38 as a senior chief, and I have not been on a ship since. Except for a carnival cruise to Cozumel, my wife dragged me on for our 25th anniversary, which she had loved and I had tolerated. My wife was Maria. She had been Maria Salazar before I met her at a wedding in Albuquerque in 1995 when I was on shore leave, and she was the cousin of the groom. And she died on the 3rd of October, 2024, of a breast cancer they caught too late in a hospital bed at Lovelace, holding my hand. She was 51. We had been married 28 years. That part matters. The rest of it does not make sense without it. We had 2 children, Anthony in Albuquerque, doing IT for the state of New Mexico, and Elena in Denver, who is a vet tech and has 2 dogs and no husband and no interest in one. They were grown when their mother died. They had been grown for 10 years. The house in Rio Rancho was not empty when she went, but it was emptier than I had expected, and after the funeral, and after the kids drove back to their own lives, and after the casseroles stopped coming, I sat at the kitchen table with a coffee cup that had been hers, and I looked at the chair where she used to sit, and I tried to understand how a house could be that quiet. I drove up to the cabin with grief in the passenger seat. I drove up there with my mother in the back seat too, in a way I did not know yet. The cabin was my father's. He bought it in 1983 when I was 8 years old. A square-hewn log structure on 5 acres at the end of a forest road in the Sangre de Cristos above Mora, and he and my mother and my older brother, Frank, and I used to drive up there every December for the first week of deer season. Dad killed his last deer on that property in 2008. He died of a heart attack in 2012. Mom held on for 5 more years and went of a stroke on her kitchen floor in 2016, alone on a Monday afternoon while she was making meatloaf. The neighbor found her when the smell of the meatloaf burning got bad enough to come through the wall. That was 9 years ago. I have been telling myself the math for 9 years. Mom died on December 12, 2016, and I drove up to the cabin last week on December 7th, 2025, and the math came out to a week shy of 9 years. A week shy of 9 years is not a long time. It feels long, it is not. Frank inherited the cabin when Dad died, but Frank lives in Tampa and has bad knees and has not been up there in 12 years, and Frank has been letting me use it since I retired. I go up the first week of December every year. I have a routine. I drive up on a Sunday with a week of groceries and the old Marlin lever action and 300 Savage that was Dad's, and I run the generator and split firewood for the wood stove, and I hunt the south slope above the cabin, and most years I do not see a deer. I do not really care about the deer. I go up to be alone with the mountain for a week and to drink Maria's coffee out of her cup at a table where Dad used to sit and to listen to the wind in the Ponderosa. This year I went up alone for the second time. Last year was the first year without Maria. I had been miserable. I had cried in the cabin once for an hour on the second night, and I had sworn I would not go back, and then I had not been able to think of anywhere else to go this December, and I had gone back anyway. The drive up takes 4 hours from Rio Rancho. I left at 6 in the morning on Sunday the 7th with a sandwich Maria's sister had made me, and I drove north on Interstate 25 and east on State Road 418 and north again on the Forest Road. And the higher I got, the more snow there was on the trees. The Forest Road was plowed up to the second turnoff, and after that it was not, and I locked the F-150 into four-wheel high and bumped over the unplowed last mile to the cabin with the chains chattering in the bed. The cabin sat where it had always sat, in the clearing at the end of the road, with the porch facing south, and the woodpile under the eave, and the corrugated tin roof bowed a little under the snow load. I parked and I shouldered my duffel and the rifle in its sock, and I tromped up onto the porch and I unlocked the door with the same brass key. Dad had carried on his key ring for 30 years. The cabin smelled like the cabin. It smelled like wood smoke and cold pine and a faint trace of the pine saw Mom had used to mop the floors before her last visit in the summer of 2016, 6 months before she died. I had not changed the soap. I bought the same pine sol every year and mopped the floors with it on the first day. I had told myself that was about cleanliness. It was not. I got the generator going. I got a fire in the wood stove. I sat at the kitchen table with my parka still on, and I drank a coffee out of Maria's cup, and I watched the snow start to come down outside the kitchen window in the kind of soft, flat way that means it will keep coming for a while. By dark, the snow was up to 4 inches, and the wind had come up out of the north, and the whole cabin was breathing the way it breathed in heavy weather, the timbers creaking and the stovepipe singing and the cold pressing in at the windows like something with a face. I ate a can of Hormel chili at the table standing up, and I read for a while by the lantern, a Tony Hillerman novel I had read 3 times before, and I was in bed under 2 quilts by 9. I slept like I always slept the first night, hard and dreamless, the kind of sleep that came from a long drive and 4 hours of physical work and the elevation. I woke up at 4 a.m. with the wind hammering the cabin and a sound from out on the porch that I could not place. It was a soft sound. It was the sound of something brushing against the door. Not knocking, brushing, like a sleeve dragged across the wood. I lay in the bed under the quilts, and I listened, and the sound came again, slow, from the bottom of the door to the top, and then stopped. I told myself it was a branch. The cottonwood by the porch had branches that came down low, and the wind had been moving them around for an hour. I told myself it was a porcupine. We get porcupines up there sometimes, and they will gnaw on the porch boards, looking for salt. I told myself a number of things. I lay in the bed for 10 minutes, and the sound did not come again, and then I rolled over and went back to sleep. In the morning the snow was 8 inches, and it was still coming down, and the wind had broken a small dead branch off the cottonwood, and the branch was lying on the porch in the snow. I stood in the doorway with my coffee, and I looked at the branch, and I told myself, see, the branch. I told myself the branch was what I had heard. I told myself the branch had not been there before, but had fallen in the night, because that was what dead branches did in heavy wind. I did not look at the snow on the porch any harder than I had to. I went up the south slope at first light. I sat in a blind I had built 10 years ago against a granite outcrop above a draw where the deer came through, and I watched the snow come down, and I did not see a deer. I do not see deer most years. I sat in the blind, and I thought about Maria, and I thought about my father, and I thought about how the snow was coming down at exactly the rate it had been coming down in the December of 2016 when my mother had died. I had driven up that night, in worse weather than this, when Frank had called me from Tampa and told me she had gone. I had sat with her body in the morgue at Mora. I had picked out the casket the next day. I had buried her on the 17th in Albuquerque next to Dad. I went back down to the cabin at 1. I made a sandwich and I ate it standing at the counter, and that was when I saw the kettle. The kettle was on the stove, the wood stove. I had not put it there. I put the kettle on for coffee in the morning, and I always took it off when I was done, because if you left a kettle on the wood stove all day, it boiled dry and the bottom went black. I had taken it off that morning. I knew I had taken it off because I had a habit of putting it on the counter next to the sink, and that was where it had been when I left for the blind. And now it was on the stove again, and it was sitting on the warmer plate where the burner pipe came through, and it was empty. I stood there with the half a sandwich in my hand, and I looked at the kettle for what must have been 30 seconds. I had been alone in the cabin all morning. I had locked the door when I left for the blind. The door had been locked when I came back. There was no one else up here. I told myself I had not put it on the counter that morning. I told myself I had left it on the stove. I told myself I was 50 years old and starting to forget things, and that was what happened to a man in his 50s whose wife had been dead for 2 years. He forgot things. He made stories up to explain why he had forgotten them. I picked up the kettle and I took it to the sink, and I rinsed it and I filled it and I put it back on the stove to heat water for a coffee. I drank the coffee at the table. I tried to read. I could not concentrate on the book. The wind had gotten worse outside and the snow was up over a foot now, and it was past 3 in the afternoon and the light was going gray. I sat at the table with the book closed in my hand, and I looked at the door of the cabin and I listened to the wind. The sound came again at 4. It was the same brushing sound on the door. I was awake this time, and I was sober, and I was in the kitchen with the lantern lit on the table, and I heard it as clear as I would have heard a knock. A slow drag, bottom to top, like a sleeve. I went to the door. I did not open it. I put my ear against the wood, and I listened. There was nothing. There was the wind in the eaves and the snow hitting the tin of the porch roof, and nothing else. I went back to the table. I sat down. I picked up the book. I tried to read. After a few minutes, I caught a smell. It was perfume. Jean Naté, the cheap drugstore body splash my mother had worn since I was a child. She had bought it in the yellow plastic bottle at the Kmart in Albuquerque, 4 or 5 bottles at a time, and she had worn it every day of her life. After she died, my brother Frank and I had cleaned out her bathroom, and I had thrown the last half-full bottle of Jean Naté in the trash because I could not stand the smell of it. The smell of it was the smell of her sitting at her kitchen table, doing the crossword in the morning. The smell of it was the smell of her in her casket. The smell of it was in the cabin now, in the kitchen, at 4 in the afternoon on December 6, 2025. I sat very still at the table. I held very still. I did not breathe. The smell came in waves, like the wind was bringing it through a gap in the door, and after maybe a minute it faded out, and the cabin smelled like wood smoke and pine sol again. I got up and I walked through the cabin. I looked in the bathroom. I looked in the back bedroom that had been Frank's and mine when we were kids, and that I did not sleep in anymore because there was a single mattress in the front room that I had moved there after Dad died. I looked under the bed in the back bedroom. There was nothing in the cabin. There was no one in the cabin. The cabin was empty. I went back to the table. I made another coffee. I told myself I was losing it. I told myself grief did things. I had said that to myself before about Maria, and I had said it to myself now about my mother, and grief did things, and I was a man alone in a cabin in a snowstorm at 50 years old, and I was hearing things and smelling things, and that was what a man alone in a cabin in a snowstorm at 50 years old did. I told myself the things I had told myself 100 times in 2 years, and I drank the coffee, and I tried to make it through the dark without losing my mind, and I did not quite make it. The whistling started at 5:30. It was outside the cabin. It was coming from the porch. It was somebody whistling How Great Thou Art, which had been my mother's favorite hymn, the one she had sung at every Easter service at St. Charles Borromeo in Albuquerque from 1970 to 2016, the one she had taught me to sing when I was 7, and she was teaching me how to read music. It was being whistled in a slow, steady tempo. It was being whistled on key. It was being whistled by somebody who knew the song. I sat at the table with the coffee in my hand, and I listened to my dead mother whistle How Great Thou Art on the porch of my father's cabin in the Sangre de Cristos. The whistling went on for the length of the first verse. Then it stopped. Then she knocked. She knocked the way she had always knocked. 3 soft taps with the side of a closed fist, not the knuckles. I had heard her knock that way on my bedroom door at the house, on Calle Encantada 1,000 times when I was a kid. 3 soft taps, a pause, 3 more. "Davy," she said. The voice came through the door. The voice was clear. The voice was my mother's exact voice with the slight rasp in it, from 40 years of Salem Lights, the voice I had not heard since 2016, and which I had been hearing in my dreams off and on since then. The voice said Davy the way she had said Davy when she was calling me from the back porch for dinner when I was 8. Davy, it's Mom. Let me in. I did not move. I did not put down the coffee cup. I sat at the table with the cup in my hand and I looked at the door. Davy, it's cold out here. I do not know how long I sat at the table. It might have been a minute. It might have been 10. The whistling started again, the second verse of How Great Thou Art, and then it stopped and she knocked again, 3 soft taps, and then she spoke. Davy, please, let me in. I am so cold. That was when I got up. I did not get up to open the door. I got up to put my back against the wall on the kitchen side of the door, where the wood was thick and where I could see the door and the windows both. And I went and I got the marlin from the corner where I had left it and leaned against the wall, and I put one in the chamber, and I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the wall and the rifle across my knees, and I watched the door. Davy. The voice came from lower now, from about the height of the doorknob, like she was sitting on the porch boards in front of the door. Davy, it has been a long time. Davy, I have missed you. Davy, it is so cold. Let me in, son. She said son the way she had said son. She had been the only person in my life who had called me son. Dad had called me Dave or Kid. Maria had called me David. Frank called me Whitlock the way brothers do. Mom had called me son. It was a small thing, and it was not the kind of word a stranger would know. Davy, open the door. I did not move. I sat against the wall with the rifle across my knees and the safety off, and I watched the door. The voice changed a little. The voice held the same rasp and the same pitch, but there was something under it now, something I had not heard at first. There was a quality to it, like a recording slowed down by a few percent, like a tape playing at the wrong speed, by just enough that you could not name what was wrong with it. The pitch was right, but the timing was a little off, a little stretched, like the words were being pulled the way taffy is pulled. Davy, open the door. Mama is so cold. Mom had never said mama. Mom had been a mom. She had not been a mama. She had grown up in Albuquerque, and she had been Mom, and she would have died before she called herself Mama. The voice on the porch had just called itself Mama, and that was when I understood that the thing on the porch was not my mother. I have thought a lot about what I knew before I knew it. I think I knew when the whistling started. I think I knew when the smell of the Jean Natte came in. I think I knew when the kettle was back on the stove. I think I knew on the first night when the sleeve dragged on the door. There are things a man knows before he lets himself know them, and the thing on the porch saying Mama was the moment I let myself know. I got up off the floor. I went to the table. I picked up the wooden ladder-back chair that had been Dad's, the one he had sat in at every meal of my childhood, and I carried it to the door, and I wedged the back of the chair under the doorknob the way you do when you want a door to stay shut. The door opened inward. The chair would not hold against a hard push, but it would hold against the doorknob being turned from the outside, which I had begun to be afraid was about to happen. Davy, the thing said. Davy, why have you locked me out? Davy, I am your mother. I did not say anything. Davy, it said. The voice was less my mother's now. The voice was still pitched like hers, but there were more layers in it now, the way a chord has more than one note. There was a deeper note under hers. There was a higher note over hers. The hers in the middle was almost the same, but not quite. Davy, let me in. I have something to give you. I made you something. I sat back down against the wall with the rifle across my knees, and I closed my eyes for a second, and I said a thing into my own head that was not quite a prayer. I said, God, if you are there, you keep this door shut. Just keep this door shut. The voice went on. It went on for what my watch said was 3 hours and what felt like 10. It said my name. It said Davy. It said son. It said open the door. It said it was cold. It said it had been a long time. It said it had missed me. The whistling came back. The whistling went away. The voice tried different things. It was patient. It was the patient kind of voice a person uses with a child who they know is going to give in eventually. Sometime around 9 in the evening, the voice said my wife's name. It said Maria. It said, Davy, Maria is here too. Maria is here with me. Maria wants to see you. Maria says she misses you. I started crying. I sat against the wall with the rifle across my knees, and the tears ran down my face, and I bit down on the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, and I did not move. The voice said Maria again. It tried Maria's voice. It almost got it. Maria's voice had a softness in the back of it from her years of teaching kindergarten, and the thing on the porch did not quite have the softness. It had the shape of the softness. It had the outline of the softness. It said, Davy, it's Maria. Please open the door. Please, I just want to see you. I had been crying for 2 years for my wife to say my name one more time. I had been on my knees at her grave in February asking God for 1 minute, just 1 minute. The thing on the porch was offering me a minute, and I knew the minute would cost me forever, and so I sat against the wall with the rifle across my knees, and I did not open the door. I sat there all night. The voice did not stop. It worked through every register a thing like that can work through. It went back to my mother. It tried Frank. It tried my daughter Elena. It tried my son Tony. It even tried the voice of a man who I think was supposed to be my father. But the thing on the porch could not get my father right, because my father had a kind of laugh I had not heard out of any other man, and the thing did not have the laugh. When the thing tried to laugh like my father, I heard, for the first time, what it really sounded like underneath. It was a sound like a wet thing in the throat. It was a sound like meat being moved. The voice stopped at 4 a.m. The wind died. The snow stopped. The cabin went quiet. I sat against the wall with the rifle across my knees for 2 more hours. At dawn I got up. My legs were dead. My back was a board. I went to the door, and I listened with my ear against the wood for a full minute. There was nothing. I unlatched the chair from the doorknob. I did not remove the chair. I lifted the latch on the door, and I pushed it open about an inch, and I looked out. The porch was empty. The snow was a foot deep on the porch boards. The woodpile under the eave had a foot of fresh snow on top of the split rounds. The mountain on the other side of the clearing was white and quiet. There were no tracks on the porch. I pushed the door open all the way. I stepped out onto the porch with the marlin in my hands and the safety still off. I walked the length of the porch, and I looked down at the snow. There were no tracks. The snow was unbroken. The snow had drifted up against the door in a soft curve, and the curve had not been touched by anything. There were no tracks coming up to the porch from the clearing. There were no tracks coming down off the porch. There was nothing. I went back inside. I closed the door. I put the chair back under the knob. I made a coffee. I sat at the table with the coffee in front of me, and I did not drink it, and I looked at the chair against the door for a long time. I went home that day. I left at noon. I shoveled the truck out. I drove the unplowed mile back down to the plowed forest road on chains. I drove 4 hours back to Rio Rancho. I did not stop at the cabin even to lock the door behind me. I locked the cabin door from the outside with a brass key, and I left. When I got home, I sat on the couch in the living room with my parka still on for a long time. The house was quiet. Maria's cup was upside down in the dish drainer where I had left it before I drove up. The light in the kitchen was off. The light on the porch was on. I called Frank from the kitchen later that night, and I told him I was not going up to the cabin anymore. He asked why. I said I had a hard week. He said, I bet. He said grief did things. I told him grief did things. Frank does not know what happened in the cabin. Tony does not know. Elena does not know. I have not been able to put it into words for anyone. I do not know how to say it in a way that would make sense, so I have not said it at all. It has been 10 days since I came back. The snow has melted in Rio Rancho. The forecast says we will have rain through the end of the week. I have started keeping the porch light on at night. I sit up in the living room until midnight or 1, and I drink a coffee at Maria's table, and I watch the porch through the window. Last night around 11, I went into the kitchen for a glass of water. The light in the kitchen was off. The light in the hall was on. The hall light made a yellow rectangle on the kitchen tile. There was a smell in the kitchen. It was Jean Nate. It was just for a second. It came in and it went out like the wind had brought it through a gap in a window, but there were no open windows in my house, and there had been no Jean Nate in my house in 9 years. I stood in the kitchen in the yellow rectangle of light from the hall, and I held very still, and I did not breathe. The kitchen chair, the one Maria used to sit in, was pulled out from the table at an angle. I had not pulled it out. I had not been in the kitchen all evening. The chair was sitting there at an angle, like somebody had been sitting in it and had just gotten up. I stood there for a long time. The smell went away. The hall light flickered once and steadied. The chair did not move. After a while, I went back to the living room, and I sat down on the couch, and I picked up my coffee cup, and I drank a sip, and the coffee was cold. I have not gone back into the kitchen tonight. I have been sitting on the couch with the porch light on and the house quiet around me. The kitchen chair is pulled out from the table. I have not gotten up to push it back in. I am not going to. Outside the window, the wind has come up. There is a soft sound on the porch. It is a sound like a sleeve being dragged down the wood of the front door, slow from the top to the bottom. The door is locked. I am not going to look